The war that created the United States began with a gunshot no one could explain, a sharp crack in the cold Massachusetts air that startled birds from bare branches and froze men in place before any of them fully understood what they were doing. It is still there if you listen closely, hovering between night and dawn, a sound that does not belong to a single person, but to a moment when fear finally outran patience. Someone pulled a trigger, or perhaps several fingers tightened at once, and the echo slid across a village green like a secret that could no longer be kept. History would later argue about who fired first, but the truth is simpler and more unsettling. By that morning, it almost did not matter anymore. The people standing in the dark were not born rebels. They were farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, and officers who still used the word subjects when speaking of themselves. They had grown up thinking of the British Empire as the most powerful and orderly system on earth, a structure that rewarded loyalty and punished chaos. Yet here they were, facing one another with muskets that took nearly half a minute to reload, hearts pounding louder than the commands whispered down the line. The night smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, of homes not yet abandoned, of lives that had not planned for war. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away or very late at night, feel free to share your location and local time in the comments. There's something comforting about knowing how many corners of the world history drifts through while we rest. The soldiers sent by the crown believed they were enforcing order. The local men believed they were defending their rights. Both ideas felt reasonable to the people holding them, and that is part of what made the moment so dangerous. This was not yet a war for independence. It was a collision of expectations, each side convinced the other would blink first. Orders were vague, nerves were frayed, and rumors had traveled faster than truth for weeks. British regulars had marched out from Boston to seize military supplies, expecting little more than a show of force. Colonial militia had gathered because they had learned, again and again, that shows of force rarely stayed symbolic for long. The American Revolutionary War, taken as a whole, is often told as a clean story with a clear moral arc. Oppressed colonies rise, liberty triumphs, a new nation is born, but at its beginning, it was neither clean nor clear. It was messy, anxious, and deeply human. People hesitated. Some refused to fire. Others later insisted they never pulled the trigger at all. Even in the first moments, the war carried an unanswered question at its center. One historians still circle today. Was violence inevitable, or did it arrive because too many small choices leaned in the same direction at once? To understand why that question mattered, it helps to imagine the long silence before the shot. For years, colonists had argued with Parliament using petitions, boycotts, and carefully worded protests. They had framed themselves as loyal Britons demanding fairness within the empire, not separation from it. The language of revolution had been present, but it whispered rather than shouted. What changed was not a single law or tax, but a growing sense that distance itself had become dangerous. Decisions made an ocean away felt arbitrary on this side of it, enforced by soldiers who did not know the names of the towns they marched through. The British Empire, fresh from victory in a global war, believed it was stabilizing its territories. The colonies, accustomed to a large degree of self-rule, experienced that stabilization as intrusion. Neither side thought it was being unreasonable. That mutual misunderstanding is one of the quieter engines of history, and it hums beneath the surface here. By the spring of 1775, compromise had become fragile. Every rumor hardened positions. Every troop movement looked like provocation. People began sleeping with weapons closer at hand, not because they wanted to use them, but because they feared being unprepared if someone else did. In the dim light before sunrise, preparation turned into reality. A line of red-coated soldiers faced a loose formation of local militia. Someone shouted. Someone else moved. Smoke bloomed, white and choking, and the sound of gunfire rolled outward, startling even the men who caused it. When the smoke cleared, bodies lay where moments earlier there had been neighbors, subjects, and citizens who did not yet know they were about to become something else. The war did not start with a declaration or a speech, but with confusion, and that confusion never fully left it. There is a strange intimacy to the American Revolutionary War that later conflicts would lack. At its outset, it was fought in familiar places, along roads people traveled daily, near homes where families waited anxiously for news. The violence felt personal because it was. It fractured communities before it ever reshaped nations. Loyalists watched in silence, unsure which way survival pointed. Patriots argued among themselves about how far resistance should go. And in London, officials read reports that grew more alarming with each courier ship, struggling to grasp how a colonial dispute had slipped so quickly toward open rebellion. Historians still debate whether that first shot was accidental, intentional, or the result of miscommunication. Some suggest a nervous militiaman fired too soon. Others point to British troops who believed they were under attack. The records contradict one another, and perhaps that is fitting. The war began not with clarity, but with a failure of understanding on all sides. What mattered more than who fired first was what followed. Once blood had been shed, restraint became harder to argue for, and memory began to harden into grievance. As the sun rose higher that morning, messengers ran down roads, spreading news that something irreversible had happened. The fighting would soon move beyond a village green, but it carried that moment with it, like a splinter lodged deep beneath the skin. Every later battle, every political decision, every declaration and alliance would trace a faint line back to that sound in the dark. The American Revolutionary War did not erupt because everyone agreed it should. It began because enough people believed, in that instant, that there was no safe way back. And yet, even here at the very start, there was hesitation woven into the story. Men stepped back from the line. Officers tried to restore order. Some of those present would later insist they had hoped the violence might still stop, that cooler heads could yet prevail. That tension between action and regret would shape the war as much as ideology or strategy. It is worth remembering, especially as the story grows louder and more dramatic, that it began in uncertainty. So the war opens not with triumph or tragedy, but with a question left hanging in the smoke. How did an empire and its colonies reach a point where a single, unexplained gunshot could change everything? To answer that, the story must move backward before it can move forward, into the aftermath of an earlier war that reshaped power, debt, and expectation on both sides of the Atlantic. The shot fades, but its echo lingers, guiding us toward the gunshot still echoed in people's minds as they tried to make sense of how things had come to this. And the trail of answers led backward more than a decade, to a very different war that had ended in triumph rather than confusion. In 1763, Britain stood at the height of its power, having defeated France in the 7 Years' War and claimed vast new territories in North America. Maps were redrawn, flags were planted, and victory parades celebrated an empire that seemed unshakable. Yet beneath the celebration lay a problem that victory had made impossible to ignore. Empire was expensive, and someone had to pay for it. From London's perspective, the logic was simple and even fair. British soldiers had fought and died to protect the colonies from French expansion. British taxpayers were already burdened by debt. The colonies, safer and more prosperous than before, should reasonably contribute to the cost of their own defense. This assumption felt so obvious to Parliament that few stopped to consider how different it sounded across the Atlantic. To many colonists, the war had been fought largely for Britain's imperial ambitions, not for their own immediate needs, and they had already paid in blood and local taxes. The empire Britain now governed was not the loosely supervised collection of settlements it had been before the war. New territories required administration. Native alliances had to be managed. Borders needed enforcement. What had once been neglect was replaced with attention, and that attention felt intrusive. British officials worried about control, especially after Pontiac's rebellion revealed how fragile peace on the frontier could be. Their response was to tighten oversight, station troops, and regulate expansion westward. Colonists, eager for land and accustomed to autonomy, saw these measures as obstacles imposed by distant strangers. Debt became the quiet engine-driving policy. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled during the 7 Years' War, and interest alone consumed a staggering portion of the budget. Raising taxes at home risked political backlash. Raising revenue from the colonies seemed not only practical but justifiable. What Parliament underestimated was not colonial resistance to taxation itself, but resistance to taxation without representation. Colonists did not object to contributing. They objected to being treated as a source of revenue rather than as partners in governance. This was not yet a cry for independence. Most colonists still considered themselves British. They celebrated the King's birthday, read British newspapers, and followed British fashions. Their protests were framed in the language of rights guaranteed by the English Constitution. They argued that Parliament could regulate trade, but not levy internal taxes without colonial consent. It was a legal argument, not a revolutionary one, and for a time it felt as though it might work. The imperial response was firm, but puzzled. From London, colonial objections sounded like ingratitude. The empire had defended them, expanded their markets, and now asked for a modest contribution in return. Why was this unreasonable? This gap in perception widened with every new policy. Each side believed it was defending fairness. Each grew increasingly convinced the other was being obstinate. The tragedy was that both were acting logically within their own assumptions. Historians still debate whether Britain had viable alternatives. Could Parliament have restructured imperial governance to include colonial representation? Could it have reduced military commitments in North America rather than expanding them? These questions linger because they point to missed opportunities, moments when the path toward conflict was not yet fixed. The empire was powerful, but it was also inflexible, bound by traditions and political realities that made adaptation difficult. On the colonial side, prosperity bred confidence. Population growth, expanding trade, and rising literacy had created a society more self-aware than ever before. Colonists compared their circumstances not to those of Europe's poorest subjects, but to an idealized version of British liberty. When imperial policies fell short of that ideal, disappointment turned into suspicion. The very success of the colonies made them less willing to accept subordinate status. By the early 1760s, the stage was set for a confrontation that neither side fully recognized. Britain believed it was consolidating victory. The colonies believed they were defending established rights. Both were looking backward to justify their actions, drawing lessons from the same war, and reaching opposite conclusions. The 7 Years' War had removed a common enemy and replaced it with a question that could no longer be postponed. What exactly was the relationship between Britain and its American colonies supposed to be? That unresolved question drifted across the Atlantic like a gathering storm. It did not yet carry the language of independence or revolution, but it carried unease. Laws passed in London now landed in colonial ports with greater frequency. Soldiers arrived not as distant protectors, but as daily reminders of imperial authority. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, loyalty began to feel conditional rather than automatic. The war that had expanded the empire had also exposed its fault lines. Britain had won territory, but lost simplicity. The colonies had gained security, but lost their sense of being left alone. Between those two losses lay a decade of escalating tension, where each new policy sharpened old arguments instead of resolving them. By the time the first taxes were announced, the ground was already primed. The victory of 1763 did not cause the American Revolutionary War, but it made it possible. As memories of triumph faded, what remained was a shared misunderstanding hardened by distance and pride. Britain moved forward, confident in its authority. The colonies moved forward, convinced that authority had limits. Neither side realized how close they were to that moment in the dark Massachusetts morning, when questions would be replaced by gunfire. The empire, after victory, looked stable from afar, but up close, the cracks were already spreading. If victory had planted the seeds of conflict, taxation was the water that made them grow. After 1763, Parliament did not immediately rush to squeeze the colonies dry, at least not in its own telling. The measures that followed were framed as reasonable adjustments, small contributions toward the cost of maintaining the empire. But in the colonies, these policies landed with a thud, each one less important for the money it raised than for what it implied about power and consent. The first shock came with the Stamp Act of 1765, a law so mundane it almost seemed insulting. It placed a tax on printed paper, legal documents, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards. The amounts were not crushing. Many colonists could afford them. What they could not accept was the principle behind them. This was an internal tax, imposed directly by Parliament, without the involvement of colonial legislatures. For people who prided themselves on their rights as Englishmen, this crossed an invisible line. The reaction was swift and surprisingly organized. Protests erupted in port cities and inland towns alike. Effigies of tax collectors dangled from trees. Crowds gathered not just in anger, but in performance, turning resistance into spectacle. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," spread quickly, less a slogan than a summary of a shared legal argument. Colonists were not rejecting taxes altogether. They were rejecting the idea that Parliament could reach directly into their lives without their consent. Boycotts followed rhetoric. Merchants agreed not to import British goods. Households made do without luxuries. These acts of economic self-denial carried a moral weight that surprised British officials. The colonies were not behaving like passive subjects. They were acting like a coordinated political community. When Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, many colonists celebrated, believing they had proven their point. Yet even that victory carried a warning. Parliament insisted it still had the authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This declaration mattered more than the repeal itself. It signaled that the disagreement was not about a single law, but about sovereignty. Britain believed Parliament was supreme throughout the empire. Colonists increasingly believed that their own assemblies held legitimate authority over internal matters. These positions were not easily reconciled, and every subsequent tax reopened the wound. The Townshend Acts of 1767 tried a different approach, placing duties on imported goods like glass, paper, paint, and tea. British officials hoped external taxes would be less offensive than internal ones. They miscalculated. Colonists saw through the distinction. Money still flowed to London. Authority still bypassed local consent. Once again, boycotts spread, and once again, the colonies discovered their collective power. What made this period especially volatile was how ideas traveled. Pamphlets, newspapers, and tavern debates transformed policy disputes into moral struggles. Writers argued not only about law, but about virtue, corruption, and the nature of liberty itself. Britain, with its standing army and professional politicians, was increasingly portrayed as a corrupt force threatening a simpler, freer society. This image was exaggerated, but it was persuasive, especially to a population already suspicious of distant power. British responses hardened in turn. Customs officials faced harassment. Troops were stationed in colonial cities to enforce order and protect revenue officers. The presence of soldiers in places like Boston deepened resentment. Colonists were required to quarter troops, a daily reminder that imperial authority now arrived with muskets. Tensions simmered, waiting for a spark. That spark came in March 1770, when a confrontation between soldiers and civilians escalated into violence. Shots were fired, and several colonists were killed in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The event was small by later standards, but its impact was enormous. Patriot leaders framed it as proof of British tyranny. Images and stories spread rapidly, often exaggerating details to inflame opinion. Britain insisted the soldiers had been provoked. Both sides believed the truth was on their side. Interestingly, this moment also revealed contradictions. The soldiers were defended in court by colonial lawyers, including future revolutionaries, and most were acquitted. It was a reminder that even as rhetoric escalated, shared legal traditions still mattered. The conflict had not yet hardened into total opposition. There were pauses, moments when tensions eased and trade resumed. But the underlying disagreement never went away. Tea, of all things, brought it back into focus. The Tea Act of 1773 was designed to rescue the struggling East India Company by allowing it to sell tea cheaply in the colonies. The price was lower than before, but the tax remained. To British officials, this seemed like a compromise. To colonial activists, it was a trap, an attempt to lure them into accepting Parliament's right to tax. In Boston, resistance took a dramatic form. Men disguised as Native Americans boarded ships and dumped chests of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party was both symbolic and strategic. It destroyed property without harming people. It turned defiance into theater, and it forced Britain to respond. Parliament did so with the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston's port and curtailed Massachusetts' self-government. The punishment was meant to isolate a troublemaking city. Instead, it united the colonies in sympathy and alarm. Historians often ask whether compromise was still possible at this stage. Some argue that cooler heads might have found a constitutional solution. Others note how deeply trust had eroded. Each tax and protest had added to a growing narrative of betrayal on both sides. Britain saw disorder and defiance. Colonists saw encroachment and disrespect. By the mid-1770s, taxation was no longer about revenue. It had become a proxy for a much larger question. Who had the right to decide the future of the colonies? The answer was not yet independence, but it was drifting closer. Protests had taught colonists how to organize. Arguments had sharpened their sense of identity. Britain, determined not to lose authority, had shown it was willing to use force. When the next crisis came, it would not be met with pamphlets and boycotts alone. The path from stamps and tea to muskets and powder was shorter than anyone wanted to admit. By the time arguments over taxes had hardened into something more permanent, the colonies had already begun to change in quieter, more practical ways. Resistance was no longer only a matter of words printed on paper or speeches delivered in crowded rooms. It was becoming physical, measured in drills, supplies, and the steady transformation of ordinary men into something that looked, at least faintly, like soldiers. The shift from protest to preparation happened gradually enough that many barely noticed it. Yet once it was underway, it proved difficult to reverse. Colonial militias were not new. For generations, local communities had maintained part-time forces for defense against raids, uprisings, or foreign threats. These militias were informal, unevenly trained, and deeply local. Men elected their officers. Service was often irregular. Yet these groups carried a powerful cultural meaning. They symbolized self-reliance, the idea that free people defended their own communities rather than relying on a distant standing army. That belief mattered enormously as tensions with Britain grew. British officials, looking at the same militias, saw something else entirely: disorder. To them, militias were unreliable and potentially dangerous, prone to panic and lacking discipline. European warfare favored professional soldiers who trained constantly and followed strict hierarchies. The British Army embodied this ideal. Redcoats drilled endlessly, moved as units, and obeyed commands without debate. The colonial preference for militias seemed amateurish at best, rebellious at worst. This difference in military culture mirrored the political divide. Colonists increasingly equated standing armies with tyranny, pointing to European history, where kings used professional forces to suppress dissent. Britain, on the other hand, viewed standing armies as tools of stability. When Parliament decided to station troops in North America after the 7 Years' War, it was not only about defense, it was about asserting authority in a place that had grown used to governing itself. As British troops appeared in colonial cities, militia activity intensified. Towns held musters more frequently. Weapons were inspected. Powder and shot were quietly stockpiled. These actions were often justified as routine, but everyone understood their deeper meaning. Preparing to defend one's town was also preparing to resist imperial authority if necessary. The line between defense and rebellion blurred. One of the most significant developments was the emergence of minutemen, militia members trained to respond at a moment's notice. The name itself carried a message. These were not men preparing for distant campaigns. They were preparing for immediate action, ready to leave their fields or shops at the sound of an alarm. Drilling became more regular. Signals were agreed upon. Communication networks formed, spreading news faster than official channels ever could. This militarization did not happen without debate. Many colonists remained uneasy. They feared provoking Britain, turning political disputes into open conflict. Others worried about discipline, about giving too much power to armed crowds. Even among those committed to resistance, there was disagreement over how far preparations should go. Yet uncertainty did not stop the process. It only made it more tense. British authorities watched these developments with growing alarm. From their perspective, colonial leaders were encouraging defiance under the guise of self-defense. Governors attempted to assert control by limiting militia gatherings and seizing weapons. These efforts often backfired. Attempts to disarm the population confirmed colonial fears that Britain intended to rule by force. Each side interpreted the other's actions as proof of hostile intent. There is an unresolved historical question here that still invites debate. Did militia organization make war inevitable, or was it a rational response to an already deteriorating situation? Some historians argue that once arms were distributed and drills normalized, violence became more likely simply because the tools of violence were close at hand. Others counter that without these preparations, colonial resistance might have been crushed quickly, making the question of independence moot. The militias may not have caused the war, but they ensured the colonies would not enter it entirely unprepared. What is clear is that the act of drilling changed how people saw themselves. Men who practiced forming lines and responding to commands began to imagine collective action on a larger scale. Community defense became linked to political rights. Protecting one's town merged with protecting one's liberty. This psychological shift mattered as much as muskets or powder. Once people believe they are capable of defending themselves, they become less willing to accept decisions imposed from afar. By the early 1770s, the colonies were dotted with these semi-organized forces, connected loosely by shared grievances and increasingly confident in their role. They were not yet an army, and they knew it. But they represented something new, a population that had begun to see armed resistance not as a distant possibility, but as a conceivable response to political failure. This transition from mobs to militias marked a turning point. Protests could be ignored or managed. Militias suggested endurance. They implied that resistance was not a momentary outburst, but a sustained stance. Britain, committed to maintaining authority, now faced not just angry subjects, but communities quietly preparing for confrontation. The presence of these militias also raised the stakes of every imperial decision. Any attempt to enforce unpopular laws now carried the risk of armed resistance. Any colonial show of force risked escalation. Both sides found themselves locked in a dilemma where caution looked like weakness and firmness looked like provocation. By the time British commanders began planning missions to seize colonial military supplies, the transformation was largely complete. The colonies had not declared independence. They had not formed a unified government, but they had crossed an important threshold. Ordinary men, once content to argue their case through petitions and pamphlets, now stood ready to act together if words failed. Remember that moment in the dark, when confusion and fear shaped the first shots. That moment was only possible because of this quieter shift that came before it. The road to open conflict was paved not just with laws and protests, but with drills on village greens, whispered plans, and the steady realization that defending rights might require more than persuasion. The march toward violence did not end with preparation. It arrived suddenly, awkwardly, and in ways that surprised almost everyone involved. When British troops set out from Boston in April 1775, their mission was not to start a war. Officially, they were to confiscate military supplies reportedly stored in the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord. The orders were meant to be firm but limited, a show of authority designed to remind the colonies who still held power. Yet, authority, once tested, rarely behaves as planned. News of the expedition leaked almost immediately. Riders moved through the countryside in the deepening night, alerting militia units that regulars were on the road. Church bells rang. Dogs barked. Men woke, pulled on clothes, and stepped into the dark with muskets in hand, unsure whether they were heading toward a standoff or a fight. By the time the British column reached Lexington Green, a small group of militia had assembled, more symbolic than threatening, a human line meant to say that the town was not undefended. What happened next remains one of the enduring mysteries of the war. Words were exchanged, commands were given, perhaps misunderstood. Then came the shot. Some accounts claim it came from the militia, others from the regulars, and some suggest a third party entirely. Smoke and noise erased clarity. What is certain is that within moments, several colonists lay wounded or dead, and the British column pressed on, shaken but determined to complete its mission. At Concord, the story repeated itself with greater force. Militia units gathered in larger numbers, watching British soldiers search for supplies. When fighting broke out at the North Bridge, colonial forces returned fire in a more organized way. British troops were pushed back, and the retreat to Boston turned into a running battle. As the regulars marched, colonists fired from behind walls, trees, and buildings. It was not a formal engagement, but it was effective. British casualties mounted, and the psychological impact was immediate. For the colonists, the day was electrifying. They had stood up to the British Army and forced it to withdraw. This was not the image they had been taught to expect. For the British, the day was sobering. What had been intended as a routine operation had exposed the vulnerability of professional troops moving through hostile territory. The assumption that colonial resistance would collapse under pressure suddenly looked dangerously optimistic. The aftermath was marked by confusion and a rush of interpretation. Colonial leaders framed the clashes as acts of self-defense against aggression. British officials described them as open rebellion. Both descriptions contained elements of truth, and both hardened attitudes. The fighting had crossed a threshold. Blood had been shed, and there was no longer a plausible way to pretend that force would not be used again. Militia poured into the area, surrounding Boston in what became an improvised siege. Farmers left fields. Tradesmen closed shops. Roads filled with men carrying whatever weapons they owned. This was not an army in the European sense, but it was a mass of armed resistance that could not easily be ignored. British troops found themselves confined to the city, dependent on supplies by sea, watching as the countryside beyond slipped out of their control. Historians often note how quickly events escalated, and this speed is itself a clue. Years of tension had built a readiness for action. Networks of communication, drilled militias, and shared grievances meant that once violence began, it spread almost automatically. The war did not require a central command to ignite. It required only a spark and a landscape already soaked in expectation. There is also a quieter question beneath the noise of musket fire. Did anyone still believe it could stop? In the days following Lexington and Concord, there were attempts at negotiation, appeals to calm, and reassurances that loyalty to the crown remained possible. Yet these words struggled to compete with the reality of armed men facing one another. Each side now had dead to account for, and memory began its work of transforming events into symbols. The clashes revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of colonial resistance. The militia fought with determination and local knowledge, but they lacked coordination and discipline. Some units withdrew quickly, others acted independently. This unevenness would matter in future battles. Still, the message had been sent. British authority could be challenged with force, and the challenge might succeed. For British commanders, the lesson was equally stark. Control of cities did not guarantee control of provinces. A hostile population could turn roads into traps and small towns into obstacles. The American landscape, wide and familiar to its inhabitants, was ill-suited to traditional European methods of warfare. Adapting would take time, and time was something the situation no longer offered freely. The day also reshaped perceptions far beyond Massachusetts. News raced through the colonies, carried by riders and newspapers. Communities far from the fighting now had to decide where they stood. Neutrality became harder to maintain. To do nothing felt like a choice in itself, and not a safe one. Now, theory had turned into experience. Lexington and Concord did not start the American Revolutionary War in a legal sense, but they made it real. They transformed resistance from an argument into a fact. Whatever hopes remained for a purely political resolution would now have to contend with the reality of men who had faced one another across a village green and fired. As the smoke cleared and the wounded were tended, one truth settled in. The conflict was no longer about preventing change, but about controlling it. The road ahead would be shaped by battles, choices, and alliances, but it would always circle back to that morning of confusion, when restraint faltered and momentum took over. Boston did not explode after Lexington and Concord. It tightened. The violence in the countryside pushed inward, compressing itself against a single city that suddenly carried far more weight than its narrow streets were ever meant to hold. British troops fell back into Boston not as a triumphant garrison, but as a force that needed walls, water, and ships. Around them, the rebellion did not charge forward. It settled in, patient and watchful, forming a loose ring that transformed the city into both refuge and trap. By late April 1775, Boston felt different even before hunger set in. Soldiers filled public spaces once meant for trade and conversation. Barracks spilled into churches and warehouses. Loyalists clung to the presence of the Crown's army as reassurance that order would return, while others quietly wondered whether the city had become a liability rather than a stronghold. Civilians who could leave often did. Those who stayed learned quickly how to measure days by supplies rather than hours. Outside the city, the colonial forces were anything but uniform. Farmers arrived with muskets used for hunting. Tradesmen brought weapons inherited from earlier wars. Ammunition was precious, counted and recounted. Camps formed on hills and fields, their organization improvised and uneven. What they lacked in polish, they compensated for with proximity and persistence. British patrols discovered that leaving the city invited harassment. Roads were no longer neutral spaces. Every mile carried risk. This standoff revealed something crucial about the nature of the conflict. Britain controlled Boston, but the colonies controlled everything around it. The Royal Navy ensured access by sea. Yet even that advantage came with limits. Ships required coordination, favorable weather, and constant vigilance. Meanwhile, colonial forces moved through familiar terrain, supported by communities that, even when hesitant, understood the stakes of cooperation. The siege was not a single line of trenches or a dramatic encirclement. It was pressure applied gradually, through presence rather than assault. British commanders faced a difficult calculation. An aggressive breakout risked heavy losses and wider escalation. Remaining inside the city meant ceding initiative and watching resistance solidify elsewhere. Neither option promised a clean solution. Within Boston, daily life grew tense and uncertain. Food shortages worsened as overland supplies vanished. Prices rose sharply, turning basic necessities into luxuries. Soldiers competed with civilians for resources, straining relations that were already fragile. Rumors moved faster than facts, feeding anxiety. Every delay in resupply felt like confirmation that the situation was slipping. For colonial leaders, the siege was both a success and a warning. Containing the British Army without a formal national force felt like an achievement, proof that resistance could hold. Yet the weaknesses were impossible to ignore. Units answered to local authorities rather than a central command. Discipline varied widely. Some men drifted home after weeks, convinced their duty was complete. Others stayed, frustrated by the lack of clear direction. This lack of unity posed a deeper question. How long could a war be sustained by enthusiasm alone? The siege did not demand complex maneuvers or large-scale coordination, but future battles would. For now, the ring around Boston held because it needed to do little more than exist. It denied freedom of movement, and in doing so, It bought time. British officials, both in Boston and in London, struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Was this a temporary uprising that would collapse under pressure, or the beginning of something far more durable? Reports sent across the Atlantic carried unease. The colonies were not behaving like frightened subjects. They were behaving like a society, testing its own capacity for resistance. Historians still debate whether the siege of Boston represented a missed opportunity for Britain or a necessary pause. Some argue that a swift, forceful strike might have broken colonial resolve early. Others suggest that such an action would have unified opposition and accelerated the move toward independence. What remains clear is that hesitation on both sides shaped the rhythm of the war. The conflict advanced in pulses rather than leaps. The city itself became a living symbol of that hesitation. It stood as proof that imperial power still mattered, yet also as evidence of its limits. British flags flew over Boston, but authority ended at the edge of the harbor. Beyond that line, the countryside operated according to new rules, enforced not by proclamations, but by collective will. The siege also deepened internal divisions. Loyalists felt increasingly vulnerable, accused of aiding an occupying force. Patriots inside the city walked carefully, balancing survival against suspicion. Families split over decisions to stay or flee. Political arguments became personal, woven into the fabric of everyday life. The revolution was no longer an abstraction. It shaped where people slept and what they ate. Outside the city, the colonial camps evolved. What began as a spontaneous gathering slowly adopted structure. Officers attempted to impose order. Supply systems, however imperfect, took shape. The experience exposed shortcomings, but also encouraged learning. Men accustomed to acting independently began to see the necessity of coordination, even if they resisted it. Time passed unevenly. Days blurred together in waiting punctuated by alarms. Small skirmishes flared and faded. No single moment decided the siege. Yet each day added weight to the realization that this conflict would not resolve quickly. The war was settling into its own pace, slower and more demanding than many had imagined. By early summer, Boston felt like a held breath. British commanders prepared for action, aware that inaction carried its own risks. Colonial leaders debated next steps, torn between caution and ambition. Both sides sensed that the stalemate could not last indefinitely. The question was not whether it would break, but how. The siege of Boston did something subtle but lasting. It taught the colonies that endurance mattered as much as courage. It taught Britain that control required more than occupying cities. Neither lesson arrived through grand speeches or decisive victories. They emerged quietly, through weeks of strain and uncertainty. As the standoff continued, attention shifted to the surrounding heights and the possibility of forcing a decision. The war, still young, was about to test whether patience could survive its first real demand for blood and commitment. Boston waited, crowded and uneasy, as the conflict edged toward its next turning point. The pressure around Boston eventually found a point of release on a pair of uneven hills overlooking the city, places that had never been meant for history and were barely finished being named when they became dangerous. Charlestown sat across the narrow water, close enough that cannon fire could reach it, close enough that whoever held the high ground would hold an argument Britain could not ignore. Both sides understood this, though neither fully grasped what the confrontation there would reveal. Colonial leaders knew their position around Boston could not remain purely passive. Containment alone would not force a decision, and the longer the British sat undisturbed, the more likely reinforcements would arrive. The heights overlooking the city offered leverage. If fortified, they could threaten British ships and artillery positions. Orders were given quietly. Men moved at night. Earth was cut and piled with an urgency that suggested everyone involved sensed they were stepping onto a sharper edge of the war. What rose in the darkness was less impressive than later legends would suggest. The main redoubt on Breed's Hill was hastily constructed, uneven and shallow in places. Tools were few. Experience was limited. Yet by dawn, colonial forces occupied ground the British could not ignore. When the sun came up, British officers stared across the water and realized the situation had changed. The rebellion had climbed. From the British perspective, allowing fortified enemy positions so close to Boston was unacceptable. Commanders debated options, but delay risked strengthening the defenses further. The decision was made to attack directly. It was a choice shaped by confidence in discipline and training, and by the assumption that colonial forces would break under sustained assault. The battle that followed on June 17th, 1775, later known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, unfolded with a grim clarity that shocked both sides. British troops advanced uphill in tight formations, their red coats bright against the green slope. Colonial defenders waited, conserving ammunition, watching the lines approach with a mix of fear and resolve. When firing finally erupted, it did not come as a panicked volley. It came in controlled bursts that tore gaps through the advancing ranks. The first British assault failed. So did the second. Each retreat left bodies scattered across the hillside, evidence that professionalism alone did not guarantee success. The colonial forces, many of whom had never faced a formal army before, discovered something crucial in those moments. British soldiers could be stopped. They could be made to retreat. The psychological impact of that realization outweighed the tactical details. Yet the battle did not end in a colonial victory. Ammunition ran low. Commands grew desperate. On the third assault, British troops pushed through weakened defenses, engaging at close range. The colonial forces withdrew, outmatched once their powder was gone. The British held the field. By traditional measures, it was their win. And yet, it felt nothing like one. British casualties were staggering. Officers who had marched into the fight expecting a quick suppression of rebellion now surveyed losses that rivaled major European battles. Victory had come at a price that could not be paid repeatedly. Confidence, though not destroyed, was deeply shaken. For the colonies, the outcome was paradoxical. They had retreated, but they had not been routed. They had stood against the British Army and inflicted serious damage. The message spread quickly. Resistance was possible, even against the Empire's finest troops. Recruitment surged. Hesitation softened. What had seemed reckless days earlier now looked necessary. Historians often describe Bunker Hill as a battle that both sides lost illusions. Britain lost the illusion that the war would be easy. The colonies lost the illusion that courage alone would be enough. Discipline, supplies, and coordination suddenly mattered more than ever. The battle clarified the scale of the struggle ahead without resolving it. There is also a lingering question embedded in the battle's legacy. Did British commanders underestimate colonial resolve? Or did they simply accept high casualties as the cost of authority? Some accounts suggest arrogance. Others point to the rigid expectations of 18th century warfare, where frontal assaults were common and withdrawal carried its own risks. What cannot be denied is that the tactics employed revealed a disconnect between tradition and terrain, between old methods and a new kind of war. The burning of Charlestown during the battle added another layer to the conflict. Homes went up in flames, smoke rising as a visible marker of escalation. The destruction hardened attitudes. War was no longer confined to fields and hills. It reached into communities, leaving scars that would not fade quickly. Neutrality became even harder to justify when entire neighborhoods could vanish in an afternoon. In the aftermath, both camps took stock. British commanders requested reinforcements and reconsidered strategy. Colonial leaders confronted the limits of their militias and the urgent need for a more structured force. The battle exposed the gap between bravery and sustainability. It was a warning delivered in gunpowder and blood. The broader meaning of Bunker Hill extended beyond Boston. Across the colonies, the engagement was discussed, argued over, and mythologized. It shifted expectations. People who had once hoped the conflict might end quickly began to prepare for something longer and more demanding. The war had announced itself as serious. At the same time, the battle revealed something quietly unsettling. If the colonies could stand their ground, what exactly were they fighting for? Rights within the empire, or something beyond it? The answer was still forming, but the question grew louder after Bunker Hill. Military confrontation had accelerated political imagination. British authority remained intact in Boston, but its foundation felt less secure. The cost of enforcing obedience had become visible. Each future decision would now be weighed against the memory of that hillside and the price paid for it. The battle did not resolve the siege, nor did it end the standoff. Instead, it reshaped the mental landscape of the war. Confidence was replaced by caution. Hope was tempered by realism. The conflict moved forward with fewer illusions on both sides. As smoke cleared from Charlestown and burial details moved across the slopes, a new understanding settled in. This war would not be decided by a single clash or a single show of force. It would demand endurance, adaptation, and choices that carried consequences long after the guns fell silent. The hills outside Boston had delivered a lesson neither side could forget, and the war adjusted its pace accordingly. The shock of Bunker Hill lingered, but it did not settle anything. Instead, it created a vacuum that demanded leadership, someone who could turn scattered determination into something that might endure a long war. The colonial forces around Boston were numerous and motivated, yet they were not an army in the true sense. They lacked unity, clear hierarchy, and a shared identity that extended beyond local loyalties. What they needed was not merely a commander in the field, but a figure who could stand as a symbol of collective purpose. That decision fell to the Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia while musket smoke still drifted over Massachusetts. Delegates understood that military action without political coherence risked collapse. The rebellion needed structure, and structure required authority that colonies with deep suspicions of centralized power were reluctant to grant. Choosing a commander would test whether the colonies could think beyond their own borders. George Washington emerged as the compromise candidate. He was not the most experienced officer present, nor the most charismatic speaker. His previous military career, largely shaped during the 7 Years' War, was mixed and at times controversial. He had made mistakes, some costly, yet those very experiences mattered. He understood the realities of frontier warfare, the limits of supply, and the dangers of underestimating terrain and logistics. More importantly, he came from Virginia, the largest and most influential Southern colony. His appointment signaled that this was not merely a New England rebellion. Washington's presence carried a quiet authority. He dressed carefully, spoke little, and cultivated an image of restraint that contrasted sharply with the fiery rhetoric of some revolutionary leaders. This was deliberate. He understood that confidence did not need volume. In a movement wary of ambition and dictatorship, his self-control was reassuring. Leadership, he believed, was as much about discipline as inspiration. When Washington arrived near Boston in July 1775, he encountered a force that reflected the contradictions of the cause. The men were brave, but undisciplined. Supplies were inconsistent. Command structures overlapped and conflicted. Units answered to colonial governments that did not always agree with one another. The army existed more as a shared intention than as an integrated machine. Washington's first challenge was not the British Army, but his own. He needed to impose order without alienating men who believed they were fighting precisely to avoid imposed authority. He began with appearances, formalizing ranks, insisting on proper conduct, and enforcing standards that many found unfamiliar. Punishments were applied sparingly but firmly. The message was clear. Resistance required responsibility. At the same time, Washington faced an uncomfortable reality. The Continental Army lacked sufficient gunpowder. Artillery was scarce. Training varied wildly. Intelligence was unreliable. Against a professional British force, these weaknesses could prove fatal. Washington understood that survival, at least in the early stages, might matter more than victory. Preserving the army itself became a strategic priority. Historians still debate whether Washington's caution was instinctive or learned. Some argue that his earlier failures had taught him the value of restraint. Others suggest that his temperament naturally favored endurance over risk. Either way, his approach would shape the war profoundly. He was not seeking glorious engagements. He was seeking to keep the rebellion alive long enough for circumstances to change. Washington's appointment also helped unify political will. Colonies that had hesitated to fully commit now saw themselves represented in the leadership. Southern delegates, in particular, could envision the war as a shared enterprise rather than a regional conflict. The choice of Washington was as much diplomatic as military, binding disparate interests together under a single command. British observers took note. Washington was respected, even by opponents. His status as a gentleman and former British officer made him a familiar figure rather than a radical unknown. This familiarity cut both ways. It lent him credibility, but it also reinforced British assumptions that colonial leadership would eventually falter under pressure. They underestimated his patience. The creation of the Continental Army marked a subtle but decisive shift. Militias still mattered, and they would continue to play crucial roles. But the idea of a national force had taken root. Soldiers now fought not only for their towns or colonies, but for something broader that was beginning to resemble a nation, even if no one yet called it that openly. Washington himself seemed aware of the weight settling onto his shoulders. Letters from this period reveal a man conscious of his limitations, wary of expectations, and determined to act with integrity. He did not promise victory, he promised effort. In a conflict built on uncertainty, that honesty mattered. As summer stretched on, the army around Boston slowly transformed. Drills became more regular, command structures clarified, morale stabilized, though it remained fragile. The British, still confined to the city, watched these changes with interest and concern. The rebellion was no longer a spontaneous uprising. It was learning how to sustain itself. The choice of a commander did not solve the colony's problems, but it gave them a center of gravity. Decisions could now be coordinated. Failures could be absorbed without disintegration. The war, still in its early stages, gained a spine. Washington's leadership would be tested repeatedly, often under conditions far worse than those he faced outside Boston. But in this moment, his presence accomplished something essential. It reassured allies, unsettled enemies, and signaled that the colonies intended to see this conflict through, however long it might take. The war moved forward with a new rhythm. Preparation gave way to organization. Enthusiasm gave way to discipline. The rebellion had found a face, and with it, a sense of direction that would soon be tested far from the hills overlooking Boston. Even as an army took shape around Boston, the meaning of the conflict was still unsettled. Men were drilling, supplies were being counted, and orders were being issued. Yet the question of why all this was happening remained strangely unresolved. The colonies were fighting, but they had not yet said what they were fighting for in clear, irreversible terms. That ambiguity could not last forever. The shift began not on a battlefield, but in words, cheaply printed, widely read, and discussed far beyond the rooms where they were written. Pamphlets circulated through towns and villages, passed hand to hand until their pages softened with use. Among them, one stood apart for its clarity and audacity. It did not argue for better treatment within the empire. It argued that the empire itself was the problem. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in early 1776, cut through years of cautious legal debate with startling directness. Paine dismissed the idea that a distant island should rule a continent. He ridiculed hereditary monarchy as absurd rather than sacred. His language was simple, even abrasive, and that simplicity was its power. He spoke to artisans, farmers, and laborers who had little patience for constitutional theory, but a strong sense of fairness. Independence, he argued, was not only desirable, it was inevitable. The pamphlet spread rapidly, reaching an audience far larger than most political writings of the era. Its impact lay not in originality. Many of its ideas had been discussed before, but in timing and tone. Paine gave people permission to say aloud what they had been thinking privately. The war no longer had to be framed as resistance in the hope of reconciliation. It could be framed as a beginning. This shift unsettled some leaders. Many delegates in the Continental Congress still hoped for a negotiated settlement. They worried that a declaration of independence would alienate moderates and invite overwhelming retaliation. Yet, events were steadily narrowing their options. British forces continued operations. The king rejected petitions. The language from London grew harsher. Fighting a war while insisting on loyalty to the authority being fought began to sound increasingly hollow. Debate within Congress was intense and uneven. Delegates balanced local opinion, international consequences, and personal convictions. Independence meant severing ties, not only political, but emotional and cultural. It meant abandoning the familiar structure of empire for something untested. For some, that leap felt reckless. For others, it felt overdue. The Declaration of Independence, adopted in July 1776, reflected this tension. It was not merely a statement of separation, but a carefully constructed argument. It listed grievances, grounded its claims in natural rights, and appealed to a global audience as much as to domestic supporters. Its language elevated the conflict from a dispute over policy to a universal struggle over legitimacy and liberty. Historians often note the document's contradictions. It spoke of equality in a society that tolerated slavery. It proclaimed rights while many remained excluded from them. These tensions were real and unresolved, embedded in the nation's founding moment. Yet the Declaration's power lay in its aspiration. It articulated an ideal that exceeded immediate reality, setting a standard that would later generations struggle to meet. Independence also changed the nature of the war overnight. What had been rebellion became revolution. Compromise with Britain became impossible without abandoning the Declaration itself. Soldiers now fought not for redress, but for survival as a separate political entity. Failure would mean not negotiation, but punishment. The international implications were immediate. European powers hostile to Britain watched closely. A colonial uprising was one thing, a declared nation was another. Recognition, alliances, and support depended on whether the colonies could sustain their claim beyond words. The Declaration was an invitation as much as a challenge. Among the population, reactions varied. Celebrations erupted in some places. In others, fear dominated. Independence was exhilarating, but it was also dangerous. Loyalists felt increasingly threatened. Neutrals felt pressured to choose sides. The social fabric tightened, leaving less room for ambiguity. For Washington and the Continental Army, the Declaration clarified purpose, but raised stakes. Victory was no longer symbolic. Defeat would be existential. The Army now carried the weight of a nation that existed more on paper than in infrastructure. That burden would soon become painfully clear. The act of declaring independence did not end debate. It intensified it. What kind of nation was being created? How would power be distributed? Who would belong? These questions hovered unanswered, even as the war demanded immediate attention. The revolution had outrun its own planning. Yet for all its uncertainty, the Declaration marked a turning point that could not be undone. The colonies had named themselves as something new. The war, already violent and costly, now carried a sense of finality. There would be no quiet return to the old order. The conflict moved forward with a sharper edge. Words had reshaped reality, and reality would soon test whether those words could endure. The army around Boston the previous year had fought without a nation. Now it fought in the name of one, fragile and unfinished, but real enough to demand defense. Independence had been declared, but it had not yet been defended. The ink was barely dry when the war shifted its center of gravity southward, toward a city whose importance outweighed its narrow streets and crowded docks. New York was not simply another port. It was the hinge of the colonies, controlling access to the Hudson River and dividing New England from the rest. Whoever held it could split the rebellion in two. Britain understood this immediately. So did Washington, though understanding did not make the problem easier. The British response to independence was swift and overwhelming. A massive fleet gathered, carrying seasoned troops, mercenaries, artillery, and the confidence of an empire that still believed numbers and professionalism would decide the matter. When these forces arrived off New York in the summer of 1776, they presented a spectacle unlike anything the colonies had yet faced. Ships filled the harbor. Red-coated soldiers disembarked in disciplined waves. It was a reminder that Britain had not been exhausted by early setbacks. It had been gathering itself. Washington's position was precarious from the start. New York was difficult to defend, surrounded by water, cut by rivers, and riddled with divided loyalties. Loyalist sentiment ran strong in the city, complicating intelligence and morale. The Continental Army, still inexperienced and unevenly trained, faced an opponent with superior numbers, better equipment, and naval support that could strike almost anywhere along the coast. The first major clash came on Long Island. British forces executed a complex maneuver, flanking American positions and exposing the fragility of Washington's defenses. The result was a sharp defeat. Continental troops broke and fled. Captures were heavy. The illusion that independence had somehow transformed militia into equals vanished quickly. What followed was not a rally, but a retreat. Washington's response revealed the core of his leadership. Rather than seeking a dramatic stand that risked annihilation, he focused on preservation. Under cover of night and fog, he orchestrated a withdrawal across the East River, evacuating thousands of troops from Brooklyn Heights without alerting the British. It was not a victory, but it was survival, and survival was suddenly precious. The campaign that followed was a sequence of losses managed carefully enough to avoid catastrophe. British forces advanced. American positions collapsed. New York City fell, becoming a British stronghold for the remainder of the war. Each defeat eroded morale, and with it, public confidence. The Declaration of Independence now looked dangerously premature to some, an act of defiance unsupported by reality. Within the army, discipline frayed, enlistments expired, desertions increased. Soldiers questioned the purpose of continued resistance in the face of overwhelming force. Civilians watched nervously as British troops reasserted control over a major city, wondering whether loyalty to the rebellion was becoming a liability rather than a virtue. British commanders, confident after early successes, believed the war was entering its final phase. They expected resistance to collapse under sustained pressure. Offers of pardon were extended to those willing to submit. The assumption was simple. Once the cost of rebellion became clear, most colonists would choose security over principle. This assumption underestimated the effect of independence itself. The Declaration had narrowed options. Surrender now meant not just reconciliation, but repudiation. For those who had publicly committed to the cause, there was no easy way back. The war had become personal, binding identity to outcome. The New York campaign exposed a hard truth. The Continental Army could not win a conventional war of movement against Britain. It could not defend cities effectively or meet the enemy head-on without unacceptable losses. What it could do, Washington realized, was endure, avoid destruction, force Britain to fight longer than it wished. Historians continue to debate whether Washington could have defended New York more effectively. Some argue that the position was untenable from the start, and that withdrawal should have come sooner. Others suggest that holding the city, even briefly, was necessary to test the army and reveal its limits. What remains clear is that the campaign stripped away illusions. Independence would not be secured through confidence alone. As autumn approached, the army retreated north and west, pursued by British forces. Each engagement felt like another step backward. And yet, the army remained intact. That fact, small as it seemed, would matter enormously. The war was not being won, but it was not being lost outright either. The fall of New York was a reckoning. It forced the revolution to confront its vulnerability. It clarified the imbalance of power. And it compelled Washington to refine a strategy built not on conquest, but on endurance and timing. The early optimism that had followed independence gave way to something quieter and more dangerous: doubt. Yet, even in doubt, the war continued. The British held the city, but not the countryside. The Continental Army withdrew, but did not dissolve. The rebellion, battered but breathing, prepared to test whether survival itself could become a form of resistance. The retreat from New York did not feel strategic while it was happening. It felt like erosion. Each step backward stripped away another layer of confidence, another illusion that the war could be won quickly or cleanly. Washington's army moved through New Jersey under constant pressure, crossing rivers, abandoning towns, watching numbers shrink as enlistments expired and morale thinned. What had begun as a declaration of independence now looked, to many, like an experiment on British forces followed with steady confidence. They occupied towns, accepted submissions, and offered pardons to those willing to swear loyalty to the crown. From their perspective, this was how rebellions ended, not with dramatic finales, but with fatigue. The longer the Continental Army retreated, the more plausible that outcome seemed. Civilians recalculated loyalties. Neutrality became a survival strategy. Patriot enthusiasm dimmed under the weight of visible defeat. Washington understood the danger more clearly than anyone. If the army dissolved, the revolution would end without a formal surrender. There would be nothing left to negotiate with, no force to represent independence beyond paper declarations. Preserving the army itself became the war's central objective, even if that meant absorbing humiliation along the way. This period revealed Washington's most misunderstood quality: his willingness to lose battles in order to avoid losing the war. Retreat, often portrayed as weakness, became a form of discipline. He resisted the temptation to make symbolic stands that would please public opinion, but destroy his force. Instead, he withdrew again at tow. The army's condition worsened as winter approached. Shoes wore through. Clothing grew thin. Pay arrived late or not at all. Men marched with bleeding feet, leaving faint traces of their passage on frozen roads. Officers struggled to maintain order among soldiers, who wondered whether endurance was being mistaken for purpose. Historians still argue over how close the revolution came to collapse during these weeks. Some point to declining enlistments and widespread despair as evidence that independence hung by a thread. Others note that resistance, though weakened, never fully disappeared. What cannot be disputed is that the psychological low point of the war arrived not after a single devastating defeat, but through accumulation, loss layered upon loss. British commanders believed they were witnessing the final stages of victory. Their forces settled into winter quarters, confident that the rebellion would not survive the cold. This confidence produced complacency. Outposts were spread thin, guards relaxed. The enemy, they assumed, was finished. Washington saw something else. He saw an opportunity born not of strength, but of necessity. The army needed a moment that could disrupt despair, something that would remind soldiers and civilians alike that the cause was not already lost. The opportunity did not need to be grand. It needed to be real. On Christmas night in 1776, Washington acted. Under cover of darkness and harsh weather, Continental forces crossed the icy Delaware River. The movement was risky, exhausting, and imperfect. Some units failed to arrive on time. Equipment struggled against ice and wind. Yet by morning, American forces struck a British outpost at Trenton, catching its defenders unprepared. The victory was small in scale, but enormous in effect. It proved that the army could still act decisively. It disrupted British assumptions. It revived morale at a moment when morale mattered more than territory. The revolution breathed again. Follow-up actions in the days that followed reinforced the effect. Washington withdrew, then struck again at Princeton, applying pressure without overextending. These were not battles of annihilation. They were carefully chosen blows designed to restore belief. The importance of these actions lies less in numbers than in timing. At the moment when surrender seemed most tempting, resistance demonstrated itself as viable. Enlistments stabilized, support revived. The army remained intact through the winter, not because conditions improved, but because purpose did. Washington's strategy during this period reshaped the war's logic. Victory would not come through decisive engagements or territorial control alone. It would come by outlasting British will, by surviving long enough for political and international conditions to shift. The army became an instrument of endurance rather than conquest. As winter settled in, the war entered a new phase. It was no longer driven by early optimism or immediate outrage. It was sustained by persistence, by the refusal to disappear even when logic suggested it should. The retreat through New Jersey, once a symbol of failure, began to look different in hindsight. Not as collapse, but as adaptation. The revolution had learned how close it could come to ending and still continue. That knowledge would shape every decision that followed. Survival had become a strategy, and survival, quietly and stubbornly, was enough. Winter did not pause the war. It pressed down on it. By the time the Continental Army settled at Valley Forge in late 1777, the conflict had shed any remaining illusion of momentum. There was no dramatic defeat driving them there, no single battlefield disaster that forced the decision. Instead, the army arrived worn down by months of marching, fighting, and surviving just well enough to continue. Valley Forge was not chosen for comfort. It was chosen because there were few better options. The land itself offered little kindness. Rolling hills, frozen ground, and thin forests provided space, but not sustenance. Makeshift huts rose slowly as men worked with numb fingers, shaping shelter out of green wood that shrank and cracked as it dried. Smoke hung low in the cold air. The camp took form not as a fortress, but as a test of whether the army could exist at all under sustained strain. Food shortages defined daily life. Rations arrived late or not at all. Men went days on little more than fire cake. a crude mixture of flour and water. Hunger dulled energy and sharpened resentment. Soldiers wrote letters home, describing conditions with a mix of endurance and despair. Disease spread easily in crowded quarters, doing what British bayonets had failed to do, reducing the army from within. Yet Valley Forge was not simply a story of suffering. It was also a turning point in discipline and identity. Washington remained with his army, sharing its hardships rather than escaping them. That presence mattered. Leadership in this moment was not about speeches or maneuver. It was about staying. One of the most significant changes came through training. European officers, most notably Baron von Steuben, introduced standardized drills and practices that transformed the army's effectiveness. His methods were blunt and practical. He focused on repetition, clarity, and simplicity. Movements that had once been chaotic became coordinated. Units learned to function together rather than as isolated groups. This transformation did not happen smoothly. Soldiers resisted unfamiliar discipline. Officers bristled at criticism. Yet, over time, results became undeniable. The army emerging from Valley Forge was not larger, but it was more cohesive. It could move, respond, and fight as a unified force, rather than a collection of local contingents. There is a persistent question surrounding Valley Forge that historians still explore. Was the suffering as extreme as later memory suggests? Or did it become amplified through myth? Records confirm severe hardship, but they also show that other winters were comparable. What set Valley Forge apart was not suffering alone, but the meaning later attached to it. It became a symbol of sacrifice, endurance, and shared identity. Politically, the camp exposed dangerous fractures. Congress struggled to supply the army, constrained by weak central authority and competing colonial interests. Officers questioned civilian leadership. Some even whispered about replacing Washington. The revolution, it seemed, faced threats not only from Britain, but from its own unresolved structure. Washington navigated these tensions carefully. He defended civilian control while asserting the army's needs. He avoided dramatic confrontations, choosing instead to endure criticism without surrendering authority. His restraint preserved unity at a moment when ambition and frustration could have shattered it. Outside the camp, the war continued in fragments. British forces held key cities. Loyalists and patriots clashed in smaller engagements. The conflict felt dispersed, unpredictable. Valley Forge became a quiet center, a place where the army absorbed pressure while the broader war shifted around it. What emerged from the winter was something new. Soldiers who survived Valley Forge did not see themselves merely as temporary participants. They had endured something that demanded loyalty beyond locality. The army had acquired a shared memory, one that bound men together more tightly than slogans ever could. As spring approached, drills continued. Supplies improved slightly. Confidence returned, not as optimism, but as steadiness. The army was still outmatched, still vulnerable, but it was no longer provisional. It had learned how to exist under pressure. Valley Forge did not win the war. It did not produce a decisive victory or alter the map. Its importance lay elsewhere. It proved that the revolution could survive prolonged hardship without collapsing. It demonstrated that discipline could emerge from desperation. It turned endurance into identity. When the army eventually marched out, it carried more than weapons. It carried the knowledge that survival itself could be shaped into strength. The war would demand many more tests, but one essential lesson had already been learned in the cold hills of Pennsylvania. Persistence, carefully cultivated, could become a weapon. While the army endured winter at Valley Forge, the war shifted in a way that few at the camp fully grasped at first. Hundreds of miles to the north, events unfolded that would quietly alter the balance of the entire conflict. This shift did not arrive through a brilliant maneuver or a sudden surge of strength on the American side. It arrived through British miscalculation, distance, and a slow tightening of circumstances that turned confidence into confinement. British strategy for 1777 aimed at control rather than annihilation. The plan was elegant on paper. Forces would move south from Canada along the Hudson River, while others pushed north from New York City. The objective was to isolate New England, the perceived heart of rebellion, cutting it off from the rest of the colonies. If the rebellion was severed, it was believed resistance would collapse into manageable fragments. The execution proved far less elegant. British command was divided, coordination uneven, and assumptions dangerously optimistic. One army, led by General John Burgoyne, advanced south from Canada with confidence shaped by early success. Burgoyne's force was well equipped and accompanied by artillery, believing its progress would be matched by support from the south. That support never arrived. As Burgoyne moved deeper into New York's interior, his situation deteriorated. Roads were poor. Supply lines stretched thin. Local resistance slowed movement at every turn. Colonial forces harassed the march, targeting detachments and cutting communications. What had begun as a demonstration of imperial strength turned into a slow grind through hostile terrain. The Continental Army, reinforced by militia, adapted quickly. Rather than confront Burgoyne directly at first, they let geography and logistics do much of the work. Trees fell across roads. Bridges vanished. Information flowed faster to American commanders than to British ones. The landscape itself became an ally. By the time fighting concentrated near Saratoga in the fall of 1777, Burgoyne's army was exhausted and increasingly isolated. American forces, under General Horatio Gates and with the aggressive leadership of Benedict Arnold, pressed the advantage. Engagements were fierce but fragmented, marked by confusion and sudden shifts rather than clean lines. Two battles near Saratoga revealed the changing character of the war. British troops fought bravely, but numbers and momentum were no longer on their side. American forces, now better trained and coordinated than in earlier years, held ground and countered effectively. When Burgoyne attempted to break free, he found himself surrounded. The surrender that followed was not merely a battlefield outcome. It was a strategic rupture. An entire British army laid down its arms to colonial forces. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. What had seemed improbable now appeared undeniable. The rebellion could defeat Britain in a major engagement. Historians often describe Saratoga as the turning point of the American Revolutionary War, and with reason. Yet, its significance extended beyond morale. It transformed perception. European powers, watching from afar, no longer saw a desperate uprising. They saw a viable contender capable of sustaining war against a global empire. France, in particular, took note. Long hostile to Britain and eager for an opportunity to weaken its rival, French leaders had been cautiously supportive of the colonies through covert aid. Saratoga changed caution into commitment. It provided proof that an alliance would not be wasted on a lost cause. There is still debate over how inevitable this outcome was. Some historians argue that British strategy was flawed from the start, relying too heavily on assumptions of loyalty and coordination. Others suggest that American adaptability and growing competence made the difference. What remains clear is that Saratoga exposed the vulnerability of imperial power when stretched across distance and unfamiliar terrain. For the Continental Army, the victory validated the painful lessons of earlier years. Discipline mattered. Patience mattered. Survival through retreats and winters had not been in vain. The army had learned how to apply pressure without overreaching, and Saratoga was the result. The surrender also carried symbolic weight. It suggested that British authority was no longer absolute, that obedience could not be restored through force alone. Loyalists felt a shift beneath their feet. Neutrals recalculated once again. The war's future no longer seemed predetermined. As news reached Valley Forge, it cut through the cold with unexpected warmth. The army still lacked food. The huts still leaked smoke and frost. But the meaning of their endurance changed. They were no longer merely surviving. They were contributing to a larger momentum that extended beyond their immediate suffering. Saratoga did not end the war. British forces remained powerful. Cities remained occupied. The colonies remained fragile. Yet something essential had changed. The conflict had crossed an invisible threshold, from rebellion towards something closer to legitimacy. The war, once isolated and uncertain, now stood on the edge of becoming international, and with that shift came opportunities and risks that would reshape its final course in ways no one at Saratoga could fully foresee. Saratoga echoed across the Atlantic more loudly than any cannon fired on its fields. In European courts, where wars were measured not only in victories but in opportunity, the news landed with a particular weight. For years, France had watched the rebellion with interest sharpened by memory. Defeat in the 7 Years' War still stung, and Britain's growing empire remained a constant irritation. Yet sympathy alone had never been enough to justify open involvement. What Saratoga provided was credibility. Before that moment, supporting the colonies had been a gamble. Aiding a losing rebellion risked wasting resources and provoking Britain without gain. After Saratoga, the calculation changed. The colonies had demonstrated that they could defeat a British army in the field. They were not merely defiant, they were durable. That distinction mattered in the quiet rooms where alliances were forged. French involvement did not arrive as a sudden rush of soldiers and ships. It emerged cautiously, shaped by diplomacy as much as enthusiasm. Negotiations unfolded in layers, balancing ambition against caution. France sought to weaken Britain without exposing itself to unnecessary risk. The Americans sought recognition, money, and military support, knowing that independence without allies would remain fragile. The alliance formalized in early 1778 transformed the war's scale. France recognized the United States as a sovereign nation, a step that Britain had insisted would never happen. With recognition came resources, loans, supplies, naval power, and eventually troops. The rebellion was no longer an internal imperial dispute. It had become part of a broader contest for global influence. This shift altered British strategy almost immediately. Britain could no longer focus exclusively on suppressing rebellion in North America. It now faced the prospect of war in Europe, the Caribbean, and beyond. Naval resources were stretched, command priorities conflicted. The empire's reach, once its greatest strength, became a liability. For the American cause, French support brought relief and complexity. Supplies improved. Confidence rose. Yet reliance on a foreign power carried its own risks. French interests did not always align perfectly with American ideals. The alliance was practical rather than romantic, grounded in mutual advantage rather than shared vision. Historians continue to debate whether independence could have been secured without France. Some argue that British exhaustion and colonial persistence might eventually have produced a negotiated settlement. Others contend that French naval power was decisive, tipping the balance in ways American endurance alone could not. What is clear is that the alliance shortened the war and expanded its possibilities. On the battlefield, the effects were not immediately dramatic. British forces remained formidable. American armies still faced shortages and setbacks. But the psychological landscape shifted. British commanders now had to anticipate French intervention at sea and on land. American leaders could plan with a horizon that extended beyond mere survival. The alliance also reshaped internal politics. Skeptics who had doubted the wisdom of independence now confronted its consequences. Recognition by a major European power lent legitimacy to the revolutionary government. It suggested that the new nation was not a temporary experiment, but a participant in international affairs. French officers and advisors began arriving, bringing experience and perspective shaped by European warfare. Cultural misunderstandings were inevitable. Differences in discipline, hierarchy, and expectation created friction. Yet these interactions also expanded the American war effort, exposing it to methods and resources previously out of reach. At the same time, the alliance provoked British retaliation beyond North America. The war widened into a global struggle, with battles and blockades in the Caribbean and on the high seas. The American Revolutionary War was no longer confined to its original geography. It had become one theater in a much larger conflict. For soldiers on the ground, especially those emerging from Valley Forge, the alliance carried a quieter meaning. It suggested that their suffering had been noticed, that endurance had produced results beyond immediate victories. The cause they had been asked to believe in now had powerful backers. Yet, dependence introduced vulnerability. If French priorities shifted, support could wane. American leaders understood this and worked to maintain credibility through continued resistance. The alliance was a partnership, not a guarantee. The entry of France marked a decisive turn, not because it solved the war, but because it redefined it. The struggle for independence had outgrown its origins. It now unfolded on a stage shaped by empires, alliances, and the balance of power. As the war moved forward, its rhythm changed again. Patience remained essential, but so did coordination across oceans. The rebellion, once isolated and improvisational, now operated within a network of expectations and obligations. The conflict's outcome was still uncertain, but the path ahead was no longer solitary. With France's entry, the American war stepped into the wider world, carrying with it hopes, risks, and a growing sense that its resolution would matter far beyond the 13 colonies. With France now openly in the war, Britain reassessed where and how it could still win. The northern colonies had proven stubborn, expensive, and politically complicated. Support there was divided. Terrain was unforgiving, and French involvement threatened British dominance at sea. In London, attention drifted southward, toward a region believed to be more manageable, more loyal, and more vulnerable to pressure. The war's center of gravity shifted again, this time toward the Carolinas and Georgia. The logic behind the Southern strategy appeared sound. British officials believed that large numbers of loyalists lived in the southern colonies, especially among recent settlers and enslavers who feared social upheaval more than imperial authority. If British forces could establish control in the South, loyalist support would rise, local militias would take over policing duties, and regular troops could be freed for operations elsewhere. It was a plan built on assumption as much as intelligence. Initial successes seemed to confirm these hopes. Savannah fell in 1778. Charleston, after a prolonged siege, surrendered in 1780, delivering one of the worst American defeats of the war. Thousands of Continental soldiers were captured. Supplies were lost. The British now held a major southern port and believed momentum had returned decisively to their side. Yet control on maps did not translate easily into control on the ground. The southern colonies were not simply replicas of the North with warmer weather. They were socially fragmented, shaped by deep economic inequality, enslaved labor, and long-standing local rivalries. Allegiances shifted quickly. Loyalist and patriot militias clashed not just as political opponents, but as neighbors with personal grievances. The war in the South took on a harsher, more intimate character. British commanders struggled to impose order once major cities were taken. Holding territory required manpower Britain could ill afford to spare. Loyalist support, while real, was uneven and often overestimated. Many who initially welcomed British troops hesitated once violence escalated and reprisals followed. Authority, once asserted, proved difficult to sustain without constant presence. For American forces, the Southern campaign was disorienting at first. Early attempts to challenge British advances ended poorly. Commanders were replaced. Morale wavered. The defeat at Camden in 1780 reinforced the impression that British regulars still dominated open battle. Once again, the revolution appeared vulnerable. What changed wasn't a single victory, but an adjustment in approach. American leaders began to recognize that the Southern War would not be won through direct confrontation alone. The terrain favored movement, concealment, and attrition. Small units could disrupt supply lines, gather intelligence, and exhaust British forces stretched thin across vast distances. This environment produced new kinds of leadership. Figures like Francis Marion, operating with irregular forces, used mobility and local knowledge to harass British positions. These fighters did not seek decisive battles. They sought to make occupation costly and uncertain. Their actions blurred the line between military engagement and civil conflict. Reflecting the region's fractured loyalties, the British response often intensified divisions rather than resolving them. Harsh measures intended to suppress resistance alienated civilians who might otherwise have remained neutral. Promises of protection and stability rang hollow when violence persisted. The assumption that loyalist support would carry the burden of control proved increasingly unrealistic. Meanwhile, American leadership in the South gradually stabilized under commanders who embraced patience over spectacle. Rather than attempting to reclaim cities immediately, they focused on wearing down British forces through maneuver, selective engagement, and disruption. This approach demanded restraint, especially in the face of calls for dramatic retaliation after defeats. Historians continue to debate whether the Southern strategy was Britain's best remaining option, or a miscalculation born of frustration. Some argue that success in the South might have fractured the rebellion beyond repair. Others point to structural weaknesses in the plan: reliance on uncertain loyalist support, underestimation of internal divisions, and logistical challenges that favored defenders over occupiers. What is undeniable is that the Southern War changed the emotional texture of the conflict. Violence there felt closer, more personal. Communities fractured along lines that did not always align neatly with ideology. The war became a series of overlapping struggles, political, social, and economic, woven into daily life. For enslaved people, the Southern campaign carried its own brutal calculus. British proclamations offering freedom to those who escaped Patriot masters drew thousands to British lines. Some found opportunity. Many found hardship, disease, or betrayal. Their choices highlighted the revolution's contradictions, exposing the distance between rhetoric and reality. As British forces pushed inland, their supply lines lengthened and their vulnerability increased. Control required constant motion. Garrisons were isolated. Communications lagged. American forces adapted to this rhythm, choosing when to engage and when to withdraw, letting geography and time erode British strength. By late 1780, the Southern War no longer looked like a straightforward British advance. It had become a grinding contest of endurance, marked by shifting control and unresolved violence. The strategy designed to end the war efficiently had instead entangled Britain in a region that resisted simple solutions. The South, once seen as the rebellion's weak point, revealed itself as a landscape where assumptions failed quickly. Victory could not be imposed through occupation alone. Loyalty could not be commanded at gunpoint. And control, once claimed, demanded far more resources than anticipated. As the campaign continued, both sides sensed that the Southern War would not produce a quick conclusion. Instead, it would test patience, adaptability, and the willingness to accept ambiguity. The conflict, already long, stretched further into complexity. The revolution had entered a phase where certainty was scarce. Each region fought its own version of the war, shaped by local realities. The Southern strategy, intended to simplify Britain's task, had done the opposite. It had widened the conflict's emotional and logistical demands, setting the stage for a prolonged struggle whose outcome would depend less on dramatic conquest and more on which side could endure disorder the longest. In the South, the war stopped looking like a single conflict and began to resemble a collection of personal feuds stitched together by ideology. Lines between loyalist and patriot rarely followed neat political theory. They ran through families, churches, and neighborhoods, cutting across old rivalries and new fears. What emerged was not just a campaign between armies, but a civil war layered inside a revolution. For many civilians, allegiance was less about belief than survival. British patrols might pass through one week, Patriot militias the next. Each arrival demanded declarations, supplies, and cooperation. Refusal carried consequences. A farmer who fed one side risked punishment from the other. Neutrality, once possible, became increasingly dangerous as suspicion replaced tolerance. Loyalist militias formed in response to British advances, encouraged by promises of protection and authority. Some were motivated by genuine loyalty to the crown. Others were driven by resentment toward local patriot leaders or fear of social upheaval. These groups knew the terrain, understood community dynamics, and could strike quickly. Their presence intensified the conflict, turning political disagreement into armed confrontation between neighbors. Patriot militias responded in kind. Raids and counter-raids became common. Property was seized. Homes were burned. Accusations of collaboration spread easily, often with little evidence. The war's violence, already harsh, became more intimate. It was one thing to face uniformed soldiers. It was another to face men whose families lived a few miles away. British commanders struggled to control these dynamics. While loyalist militias were useful, they were also unpredictable. Their actions often provoked retaliation that undermined British efforts to present themselves as restorers of order. Attempts to restrain excesses frequently came too late. Authority fractured, even among those nominally on the same side. This internal conflict reshaped the war's moral landscape. Patriot rhetoric spoke of liberty and rights, yet local enforcement sometimes relied on coercion and intimidation. Loyalists claimed loyalty to lawful authority, yet often engaged in violence that felt lawless to those who suffered it. Ideals collided with reality, leaving many civilians disillusioned with both sides. Historians continue to debate how decisive this internal war was. Some argue that it drained British resources and eroded loyalist credibility, making sustained occupation impossible. Others suggest it hardened divisions that persisted long after independence, shaping regional politics for generations. What is clear is that the war among neighbors altered the revolution's character in ways military victories alone could not. Enslaved people navigated this fractured landscape with limited but consequential choices. Some sought refuge with British forces, drawn by promises of freedom or at least escape from immediate bondage. Others remained with Patriot masters, calculating risks carefully. Their decisions, often made under extreme pressure, highlighted the revolution's contradictions and the uneven distribution of its promises. For American commanders attempting to impose strategy, the chaos posed a dilemma. Irregular warfare could weaken British control, but unchecked violence risked alienating civilians whose support was essential. Balancing disruption with restraint proved difficult. Orders issued from afar often collided with local realities shaped by fear and vengeance. The emotional toll of this internal war was heavy. Communities fractured in ways that could not easily be repaired. Even after battles ended, memories lingered. Grievances hardened into stories passed down through families, shaping how the revolution would later be remembered in the South, not as a clean struggle for independence, but as a time when trust collapsed. British hopes that loyalist strength would carry the burden of control faded gradually. Support existed, but it was uneven and costly to mobilize. Loyalists needed protection, supplies, and leadership Britain could not always provide. Without sustained backing, many were left exposed, their allegiance turning from asset to liability. For the broader war effort, this internal conflict had a paradoxical effect. It intensified suffering while diluting British power. Resources were diverted to policing and retaliation rather than decisive engagement. The rebellion, fragmented yet persistent, proved harder to crush than a unified opponent. By the end of this phase, the Southern War looked nothing like the orderly campaign planners in London had imagined. Control shifted constantly. Authority was contested daily. Victory could not be declared simply by holding cities or winning battles. It depended on managing a population exhausted by violence and distrust. The war among neighbors revealed the revolution's cost in its most human form. It stripped away comforting narratives and exposed the price of choosing sides when choices were limited and consequences severe. Independence, whatever it might ultimately bring, would not erase these scars. As the conflict ground on, American leaders increasingly understood that winning the war required more than defeating British armies. It required surviving this internal fracture without letting it consume the cause itself. The southern colonies, once viewed as Britain's advantage, had become a landscape where certainty dissolved and endurance mattered more than allegiance. The revolution pressed forward through this disorder, shaped by it and scarred by it. The war had become something that could not be neatly summarized or easily ended. It demanded patience, restraint, and an acceptance that some damage would be permanent. Out of that uneasy reality, the final phase of the conflict would eventually emerge, carrying with it lessons learned in the most painful way possible. Out of the disorder in the South emerged a quieter kind of leadership, one that resisted the urge for spectacle and instead embraced exhaustion as a weapon. Nathaniel Greene did not arrive with promises of swift victory or decisive battles. He arrived with an understanding shaped by years of watching stronger armies falter. Appointed to command the Southern Department late in 1780, he inherited a situation that looked almost hopeless. Scattered forces, low morale, hostile territory, and an enemy that still believed control was within reach. Greene's response was not to concentrate strength, but to divide it. This choice puzzled critics and alarmed allies. Splitting an already weak army seemed reckless. Yet Greene understood the geography and psychology of the Southern War. British forces depended on long supply lines and local cooperation. Forcing them to chase smaller units across wide distances would stretch those lines thinner with every mile. Instead of defending territory, Greene defended time. He withdrew when necessary, advanced when conditions favored him, and avoided the kind of large-scale engagements that had destroyed earlier American armies in the region. Each movement forced British commanders to react, burning energy and resources without delivering a decisive blow. Victory in this framework was not measured by land gained, but by pressure sustained. The campaign unfolded like a long chess match played across forests, rivers, and exhausted towns. Skirmishes flared, faded, and reappeared elsewhere. British forces won battles, yet found themselves weaker afterward. American units retreated, yet emerged intact, regrouping just far enough away to remain a threat. The war moved constantly, denying either side the comfort of stability. One engagement in particular illustrated Greene's approach. At Guilford Courthouse in early 1781, American forces stood and fought more directly than usual. The battle ended with British troops holding the field, but their casualties were severe. It was another tactical loss that functioned as a strategic gain. The British commander, Cornwallis, had won, yet been trained, forced to reconsider what winning even meant under such conditions. Historians often debate whether Green intended such outcomes precisely or adapted as circumstances evolved. What is clear is that he accepted loss as part of progress. He understood that survival and pressure could erode British strength more effectively than dramatic triumphs. This mindset marked a maturation of American strategy, shaped by years of hard lessons. The Southern population, already weary, felt the effects of this prolonged contest. Movement meant requisitioning, retreat meant disruption. Yet Green's approach gradually reduced the intensity of direct occupation. British forces, increasingly strained, found it harder to impose control even where they technically prevailed. Cornwallis, frustrated by the inability to secure lasting dominance, made a consequential decision. He moved north, hoping to find relief, resupply, and perhaps a clearer path to ending the war. This shift was not a retreat in name, but it carried the weight of one. The Southern strategy, meant to simplify Britain's task, had reached a point of diminishing returns. Green remained behind, methodically reclaiming ground as British units withdrew. Downs changed hands without fanfare. Control returned, not through celebration, but through absence. The British presence receded, leaving behind exhausted loyalists and fractured communities. The war did not end in the South, but its character changed. It lost momentum. There is an unresolved question embedded in Green's campaign. Was this style of warfare intentional innovation or forced adaptation? Some historians argue that American commanders simply did what necessity required. Others see in Green's actions an early form of strategic thinking that valued attrition over confrontation. The distinction matters less than the result. British strength declined steadily without a single decisive American victory. This approach also reduced the emotional volatility that had defined earlier phases of the Southern War. As British forces moved away from interior regions, the intensity of neighbor against neighbor violence eased slightly. The damage remained, but the pressure shifted elsewhere. By mid-1781, the Southern campaign no longer looked like Britain's best chance at resolution. It looked like a drain. Resources flowed in without producing clarity. Every mile marched produced fewer returns. The rebellion, fragmented yet resilient, refused to collapse. Green's success lay in redefining progress. He showed that a weaker force could dictate terms by refusing to play by expectations. He did not defeat the British Army in the South. He exhausted it. And exhaustion, once set in motion, proved difficult to reverse. As Cornwallis moved northward, carrying the weight of this attritional struggle with him, the war's center began to shift again. The South had done its work, not by delivering a final blow, but by reshaping conditions under which such a blow might one day land. The revolution advanced not through triumph, but through persistence sharpened into method. Green's campaign demonstrated that patience, when applied deliberately, could become decisive. The war, long and draining, was being steered toward a conclusion not yet visible, but increasingly possible. While armies marched and retreated across forests and fields, another struggle unfolded more quietly, one that rarely produced stirring speeches or dramatic last stands, yet shaped outcomes with relentless consistency. Control of the sea did not inspire the same emotional loyalty as control of land, but it determined which victories could be sustained and which would quietly dissolve. The American Revolutionary War though fought largely on shore, was never truly terrestrial. It floated on water, dependent on tides, winds, and ships that most civilians would never see. From the beginning, Britain's naval superiority was unquestioned. The Royal Navy was the largest and most experienced maritime force in the world, capable of projecting power across oceans. Its ships blockaded ports, transported troops, and protected supply lines. For Britain, naval dominance was not just an advantage. It was the backbone of empire. Losing it was almost unthinkable. For the colonies, the sea represented vulnerability. Without a navy to speak of, American ports lay exposed. Trade faltered under blockade. Supplies grew scarce. Early attempts to challenge British shipping relied on privateers, privately owned vessels authorized to capture enemy ships. These crews were motivated by profit as much as patriotism, and their success was uneven. Yet they forced Britain to divert naval resources, complicating what might otherwise have been a straightforward blockade. The entry of France altered this balance gradually, rather than instantly. French naval power did not sweep British ships from American waters overnight. Instead, it introduced uncertainty. British commanders now had to anticipate French fleets, protect convoys more carefully, and coordinate across greater distances. The sea, once a reliable highway, became contested space. Naval warfare was defined by patience and timing. Fleets maneuvered for position, often avoiding direct confrontation unless conditions favored them. Weather played an outsized role. A favorable wind could transform a stalemate into opportunity. A sudden storm could scatter even the best prepared force. Decisions made days earlier could be undone in hours by shifting conditions. Historians often point out that naval operations rarely captured public imagination during the war. Battles at sea lacked the immediate symbolism of land engagements tied to towns and territories. Yet their impact was profound. Control of shipping determined whether armies could be supplied, whether reinforcements arrived, and whether victories could be exploited. Without maritime support, success on land was fragile. The Caribbean became a crucial theater in this naval contest. Sugar islands generated enormous wealth, and their defense mattered deeply to European powers. Britain and France diverted ships and attention there, reducing resources available in North America. The American War, increasingly global, was now entangled in imperial priorities far beyond the colonies themselves. For American leaders, this dispersion of British focus was a quiet gift. The more Britain had to defend elsewhere, the less pressure it could sustain in any single place. The war's endurance began to work in the colonies' favor, not because American forces grew overwhelmingly strong, but because British commitments grew overstretched. French naval involvement also created opportunities for coordination previously impossible. Joint planning between American and French commanders required trust, communication, and timing across languages and traditions. Misunderstandings were common, yet when cooperation succeeded, it amplified American capabilities dramatically. The British Navy remained formidable, but it was no longer uncontested. Convoys moved with greater caution. Blockades tightened in some areas and loosened in others. The sea war became a game of margins, where small advantages accumulated slowly but decisively. There is an open debate among historians about whether naval superiority alone could have ended the war. Some argue that Britain's failure lay not in losing control of the sea entirely, but in failing to use it decisively at the right moments. Others suggest that once France entered the conflict, absolute control became unattainable, and Britain's strategy had to adapt to a reality it had not planned for. What is clear is that naval power shaped the war's tempo. It determined when campaigns could be launched and when they had to pause. It influenced where British commanders could safely operate and where they could not. It created windows of opportunity that, if missed, might not reopen. For civilians, the effects were indirect but deeply felt. Shortages in coastal towns reflected blockade patterns. Prices rose and fell with the success or failure of convoys. News from abroad arrived sporadically, carried by ships that might or might not make port. The war's progress often felt distant, filtered through rumor and delay. As the conflict moved into its later years, the importance of coordination between land and sea grew more apparent. Victories required alignment across domains. A successful siege needed naval support. A promising campaign could falter without it. The war had matured into a complex system where no single element could operate independently. The sea did not belong fully to either side, and that ambiguity mattered. It denied Britain the certainty it had relied on for generations. It gave the Americans and their allies space to maneuver, to wait, and to strike selectively. Endurance, once again, found reinforcement in circumstances rather than sheer strength. As fleets crossed paths and blockades shifted, the war edged closer to a moment where land and sea would briefly align. That convergence would not come through brute force alone, but through timing, coordination, and the accumulation of small, patient advantages. The horizon, once dominated by British sails, now carried possibilities that had not existed before. The war's outcome remained undecided, but the conditions necessary for resolution were quietly assembling beyond the coastline. Carried on currents most would never see, yet all would feel. As the war stretched into its sixth year, danger no longer came only from enemy fire. It crept inward, quietly, through empty purses, unpaid wages, and a growing sense that ideals were being asked to survive without material support. The revolution faced a crisis, not of courage, but of capacity. Victory required resources, and resources were becoming painfully scarce. Money, or the lack of it, haunted every level of the American war effort. Congress had limited authority to tax and relied instead on printing paper currency and requesting funds from the states. At first, this improvisation seemed workable. Over time, it became destructive. Inflation surged. Continental currency lost value so rapidly that it became a punchline, its worth measured less in purchasing power than in irony. Soldiers were paid in notes that could barely buy bread. Civilians grew reluctant to accept paper promises in exchange for real goods. The consequences reached the army quickly. Supplies slowed. Contractors hesitated. Men who had endured years of hardship now faced the reality that their sacrifices might never be compensated. Resentment simmered beneath discipline, threatening to undo what endurance had built. Mutinies, once unthinkable, erupted. They were not acts of rebellion against independence, but demands for recognition and fairness. Soldiers marched not toward the enemy, but toward their own leaders, insisting on pay, food, and respect. These moments exposed the fragile bond between principle and practicality. Loyalty could not survive indefinitely without sustenance. Washington confronted these crises with a mixture of firmness and empathy. He understood the legitimacy of the grievances, having watched his army suffer alongside him. Yet he also knew that disorder could destroy everything they had fought to preserve. Mutinies were suppressed, but with restraint. Negotiations followed punishment. Promises were made, even when fulfillment remained uncertain. Authority held, but just barely. Civilian confidence wavered as well. Farmers hoarded goods. Merchants demanded hard currency. States prioritized local needs over collective responsibility. The revolution's decentralized structure, once a safeguard against tyranny, now revealed its weaknesses. Coordination faltered. Trust thinned. Historians often debate whether this internal strain posed a greater threat than British arms. Some argue that collapse from within was the most plausible path to defeat. Others note that the very persistence of the war forced political innovation, pushing the colonies to confront the limits of their existing arrangements. Crisis became a catalyst. The faith that sustained the revolution during its early years now required reinforcement. Ideals alone could inspire action, but they could not replace food, clothing, or pay. Leaders began to recognize that independence demanded institutions as well as rhetoric. The war was exposing the difference between resisting authority and exercising it. Foreign loans provided temporary relief, but they came with obligations and uncertainty. Dependence on external support underscored vulnerability. Each shipment of supplies arrived as a reminder that survival hinged on forces beyond domestic control. Morale became a delicate balance. Victories lifted spirits briefly. Defeats threatened collapse. Yet beneath these fluctuations, a quieter resolve persisted. Many soldiers and civilians had crossed a threshold where returning to British rule no longer felt like a solution, regardless of hardship. The revolution endured not because conditions improved, but because alternatives diminished. The crisis of money and faith forced a reckoning. The war was no longer sustained by outrage or optimism. It was sustained by commitment, tested to its limits. Those limits bent, sometimes alarmingly, but did not break. As the conflict moved forward, it did so under strain that reshaped priorities. Efficiency mattered more than enthusiasm. Reliability mattered more than rhetoric. The revolution was learning, painfully, what it meant to govern even before it officially existed. Out of this period emerged a sobering understanding. Independence, if achieved, would arrive with debts, financial, political, and moral, that could not be ignored. The war was not merely about winning freedom. It was about proving that freedom could be maintained under pressure. The army held. The cause endured. Not because belief was unshaken, but because doubt had been faced and survived. The revolution moved on, thinner, wearier, but still standing, carrying the knowledge that its greatest challenges were no longer theoretical. They were lived, measured, and unresolved. By the time the war reached this stage, failure no longer needed to come from defeat in battle. It could come from fracture. And no fracture exposed the revolution's internal tension more sharply than the collapse of trust surrounding Benedict Arnold. His name, once spoken with admiration, became synonymous with betrayal, but the path to that moment was neither sudden nor simple. It unfolded gradually, shaped by ambition, resentment, and a sense of being perpetually undervalued. Arnold had been one of the revolution's most capable battlefield commanders. His early service was marked by energy and courage. He took risks others avoided, pushed men hard, and delivered results when circumstances were chaotic. Yet recognition never seemed to follow in proportion to his effort. Promotions passed him by. Accusations of corruption, some exaggerated, some poorly handled, damaged his reputation. Each slight deepened the conviction that his sacrifices were being ignored. The revolution, already strained by shortages and political infighting, proved ill-equipped to manage personalities as volatile as Arnold's. Congress hesitated. Investigations dragged on. Washington supported Arnold when he could, but even that support could not fully counter the weight of suspicion and delay. For a man driven by honor as much as by ambition, patience wore thin. Financial pressure worsened matters. Arnold lived beyond his means, partly to maintain status, partly out of habit. Inflation eroded his income. Debts mounted. Marriage into a loyalist-leaning social circle in Philadelphia introduced new influences and reopened old loyalties. The war, which had once offered purpose, now felt like a trap closing in. Historians still debate Arnold's motivations. Some emphasize greed. Others point to wounded pride or ideological confusion. What emerges most clearly is a convergence of pressures rather than a single cause. Arnold came to believe that the revolution had failed him personally, and from that belief, justification followed. The opportunity for betrayal arose through his appointment to command West Point, a strategic fortress controlling the Hudson River. Its importance was obvious. If lost, British forces could sever New England from the rest of the colonies, reviving a strategy that had already nearly succeeded. Arnold's position placed him at the intersection of trust and vulnerability. Arnold's secret correspondence with British intelligence unfolded cautiously. Plans were discussed. Signals were arranged. The betrayal was not impulsive, it was deliberate. Yet, it unraveled quickly. The capture of British officer John Andre exposed the plot before it could be executed. Arnold fled to British lines, escaping punishment but sealing his legacy. The revelation stunned the colonies. Trust, already fragile, took another blow. If a man of Arnold's prominence could defect, who else might? Suspicion spread. Loyalty tests hardened. The revolution grew more guarded, less forgiving of dissent. Washington's response was measured but deeply personal. He had trusted Arnold, defended him, and valued his talent. The betrayal cut close, yet Washington resisted, turning the episode into a purge. He understood that fear could do as much damage as treachery itself. For the British, Arnold's defection offered limited practical gain. He provided intelligence and later commanded forces against his former compatriots. But he never delivered the decisive blow his betrayal had promised. Instead, his presence complicated British relations with loyalists, who resented his sudden elevation, and with British officers who never fully trusted him. The episode revealed something uncomfortable about the revolution. It was not sustained solely by virtue or unity. It depended on individuals who could falter under pressure. Ideals did not erase ego, ambition, or grievance. They merely competed with them. Arnold's betrayal also sharpened American resolve in a paradoxical way. It forced the revolution to confront its vulnerabilities without collapsing under them. Trust had been misplaced, but the cause survived. The war did not hinge on a single man, no matter how capable he had once been. In the broader arc of the conflict, the betrayal marked a moment of sobering clarity. The revolution was not a moral monolith. It was a human enterprise, shaped by conflicting motives and fragile alliances. Victory, if it came, would not arrive because everyone was virtuous. It would arrive despite the fact that some were not. As the war continued, Arnold's name receded from strategic importance, but grew in symbolic weight. He became a warning rather than a weapon, a reminder that internal collapse remained a constant risk. The revolution carried that lesson forward, tightening discipline and redefining loyalty not as blind faith, but as commitment sustained under strain. The conflict pressed on, scarred but intact. Betrayal had been revealed and absorbed without destroying the structure holding everything together. That endurance mattered. It suggested that the revolution, though imperfect and wounded, had grown resilient enough to survive even the loss of trust at its core. The war did not stay contained within the 13 colonies, no matter how often maps tried to suggest otherwise. By the early 1780s, it had spilled outward, touching coastlines and trade routes that most Americans would never see, yet depended upon every day. What had begun as a struggle over representation and authority had become a global contest, shaped by empires pursuing their own interests under the cover of American independence. Spain entered the conflict not as an ally of the United States, but as a partner of France, motivated by its own long-standing rivalry with Britain. Its goals were pragmatic: regain lost territory, weaken British influence, and protect its vast holdings in the Americas. Spanish involvement stretched British defenses further, opening new fronts along the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi River. The war's geography widened, even as its resolution remained elusive. In the Caribbean, naval clashes and island campaigns carried enormous economic stakes. Sugar islands were among the most valuable possessions in the Atlantic world, and their defense drew ships and soldiers away from North America. Britain found itself fighting to protect wealth rather than suppress rebellion, forced to prioritize resources where profit, not principle, was most at risk. Every ship diverted south was one less enforcing blockades or transporting troops along the American coast. These global pressures altered British calculations. The war was no longer measured solely by the prospect of restoring authority in the colonies. It was weighed against losses elsewhere, against the cost of defending trade routes, against the danger of overextension. Victory in America began to look less decisive when it threatened weakness in Europe or the Caribbean. For the Americans, this widening conflict offered indirect relief. British attention fractured. Opportunities emerged not through direct confrontation, but through absence. Where pressure eased, resistance persisted. Where resources thinned, endurance paid dividends. Yet global war also introduced new uncertainties. American leaders had limited influence over Allied priorities. French and Spanish decisions were guided by imperial interests that did not always align neatly with American aims. Support came with expectations, and timing did not always cooperate. The revolution now unfolded within a web of diplomacy that extended far beyond its original grievances. News from abroad arrived slowly and unevenly, carried by ships that might be delayed or intercepted. Victories and defeats overseas filtered into colonial life as rumor before confirmation. The war felt simultaneously expansive and distant, its consequences shaping local conditions without always being visible. Historians often note that this global dimension was both a blessing and a risk. It weakened Britain, but it also complicated peace. Ending the war would require negotiation among powers with different goals, some of which had little to do with American independence itself. The conflict's resolution would not be determined solely on American soil. As British commanders grappled with these pressures, strategic clarity became harder to maintain. Decisions made in London had to account for threats thousands of miles apart. The empire's strength, once built on global reach, now strained under its own complexity. For American forces, the global war reinforced a lesson learned repeatedly. Time favored those who could endure. Every month, the conflict continued, increased the cost for Britain, and deepened foreign investment in the outcome. Independence remained uncertain, but it no longer stood alone. The war's center began to drift again, shaped less by ideology than by logistics and opportunity. Movements north and south reflected not grand design, but adaptation to pressure. British forces sought positions that could be defended with limited resources. American leaders watched carefully, aware that moments of alignment between land and sea could be decisive if seized. This phase of the war lacked the drama of earlier declarations or sudden victories. It unfolded quietly, through correspondence, shipping routes, and shifting priorities. Yet, its impact was profound. The revolution was no longer a local disturbance. It was embedded in the calculations of empires, as global commitments pulled British strength in multiple directions. The war edged toward a narrowing set of possibilities. Resolution would not come from overwhelming force alone. It would come from convergence of timing, coordination, and exhaustion. The world had entered the American war, not out of idealism, but out of interest. That reality carried both opportunity and constraint. Independence, if achieved, would emerge not from isolation, but from entanglement in a global struggle, whose final chapter was drawing closer, even if no one yet knew where it would be written. By the summer of 1781, the war had narrowed without announcing it was doing so. After years of movement, argument, and attrition, attention drifted toward a modest port town in Virginia that few had previously imagined as decisive. Yorktown did not look like a place where empires settled accounts. It sat quietly along the Chesapeake, more notable for its position than its scale. Yet, position, in war, often matters more than appearance. British General Charles Cornwallis arrived there, not in triumph, but in search of stability. His southern campaign had drained strength without delivering clarity. Pursued indirectly, worn down by constant movement, and unable to secure lasting control inland, he sought a defensible location where naval support could restore flexibility. Yorktown offered deep water access and a chance to regroup. It was meant to be a pause, not a trap. The geography of the Chesapeake region made Yorktown attractive and dangerous at the same time. Rivers acted as highways, but also as constraints. Movement depended on ships. Once committed to the peninsula, options narrowed. Cornwallis accepted the risk, believing British naval superiority would remain reliable. That belief would soon be tested. American and French commanders recognized opportunity almost simultaneously. Washington, long accustomed to waiting for alignment rather than forcing outcomes, saw in Cornwallis's position the possibility he had rarely been offered. A British army exposed to coordinated pressure by land and sea. French commanders shared this assessment, understanding that naval presence would be decisive. The plan that formed required precision rather than audacity. French naval forces would need to control the Chesapeake long enough to isolate Yorktown. American and French land forces would need to converge quickly, without alerting the British to the true objective. Secrecy, timing, and cooperation mattered more than raw strength. Washington executed one of the war's most effective deceptions. He maintained the appearance of preparing to strike New York, keeping British attention focused north. Meanwhile, the main force moved south in stages, its destination disguised even from some of those marching. The army, hardened by years of endurance, moved with discipline born of experience rather than enthusiasm. The arrival of the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse proved decisive. In September 1781, French ships engaged British naval forces and denied them control of the Chesapeake. The engagement was not a dramatic annihilation, but it accomplished what mattered most. It closed the sea. Cornwallis's assumption of reliable evacuation and resupply collapsed quietly, replaced by isolation. As American and French troops surrounded Yorktown, the war's tempo shifted. There was no rush. Trenches were dug methodically. Artillery was positioned carefully. The siege unfolded with deliberate patience, shaped by European practice, refined through American persistence. Each day narrowed Cornwallis's options further. Inside Yorktown, conditions deteriorated, supplies dwindled, morale sagged. Attempts to break out or escape by water failed. The British Army, still disciplined and capable, found itself constrained by circumstances rather than defeated by force. The realization settled slowly, and then, all at once, there would be no relief. Historians often emphasize how much depended on coordination at Yorktown. Without French naval control, the siege would have been impossible. Without American endurance, the opportunity would not have been seized. Neither side alone could have produced the outcome. The war's long arc had bent toward this convergence, shaped by years of restraint and adaptation. Cornwallis delayed surrender as long as possible, hoping for change. When it became clear that none would come, negotiations began. The formalities were dignified, almost subdued. There was no chaos, no final desperate charge. The war, which had begun in confusion, approached its decisive moment in quiet inevitability. On October 19, 1781, British forces marched out and laid down their arms. The ceremony was restrained, marked more by exhaustion than triumph. American and French troops stood witness not to glory, but to resolution. The surrender did not end the war legally, but it ended it effectively. The significance of Yorktown extended beyond numbers. It demonstrated that Britain could no longer impose its will at acceptable cost. The loss was not merely military, it was political. Support for continuing the war in Britain collapsed rapidly. The question shifted from how to win to how to conclude. For Washington, Yorktown validated a strategy built on patience rather than brilliance. He had not sought a single decisive battle early in the war. He had waited for conditions to make one possible. When they arrived, he acted. The convergence at Yorktown felt almost anticlimactic to those who had endured the war's earlier chaos. There was no sense of sudden transformation. Instead, there was release. Years of uncertainty loosened their grip. The conflict, which had demanded constant vigilance, finally exhaled. Yorktown did not resolve every question. It did not heal divisions or repay debts. It did not guarantee stability, but it closed the space in which the war could continue meaningfully. The rebellion had become something more durable than Britain could afford to contest. As news spread, reactions varied, celebration mixed with disbelief. The war had shaped lives so completely that imagining its end required adjustment. Yet the meaning was clear enough. The path ahead would be political rather than military. The final act had not yet been written, but its shape was visible. The war had been decided not by sudden genius, but by alignment of allies, of timing, of endurance, refined into opportunity. Yorktown stood as proof that persistence, when sustained long enough, could finally find its moment. The surrender at Yorktown sounded louder in memory than it did on the day itself. There were drums, formalities, and the slow movement of defeated troops, but no explosion of violence or chaos. What made the moment heavy was not noise, but realization. An entire British army had been removed from the field, and with it, the last credible path to restoring control by force. The war did not end in a blaze. It ended in a closing door. For Cornwallis's soldiers, the march to surrender carried a sense of stunned disbelief. Many had expected relief until the final days. The absence of British sails on the horizon said everything words could not. Years of discipline and training had not failed them. Circumstance had. They laid down arms not because they were beaten in spirit, but because there was nowhere left to go. American and French forces received the surrender with restraint. There was pride, certainly, but it was muted by exhaustion and by awareness of what the moment represented. This was not the end of hardship. It was the end of fighting that could plausibly continue. The distinction mattered. Washington understood this instinctively. He did not celebrate extravagantly. He maintained order, formality, and distance. The habits formed over years of restraint did not dissolve at victory's edge. He had learned too well how fragile momentum could be, how easily confidence could turn into overreach. This was a moment to preserve credibility, not squander it. The immediate military consequences were clear. British forces still occupied New York and other positions, but without an army capable of offensive action, their presence became static. The war shifted into a holding pattern. Skirmishes faded, movement slowed. What remained was tension without direction. In Britain, the political impact was swift and decisive. News of Yorktown reached London like a weight dropped onto an already strained structure. Support for continuing the war collapsed across party lines. The cost, financial and human, no longer appeared defensible. Parliament debated not strategy, but exit. Historians often note that Britain did not lose the war because it lacked strength, but because it lost justification. Yorktown removed the argument that victory remained within reach. Without that argument, persistence became pointless. The empire had other priorities, other fronts, and other risks. America no longer justified the drain. For loyalists, Yorktown carried a quieter dread. Many had cast their fate with the crown, believing imperial authority would prevail. Now they faced uncertainty, displacement, and in some cases, retaliation. Their future became one of the war's unresolved questions, postponed but unavoidable. In the colonies, reactions unfolded unevenly. Some celebrated openly, others responded with caution, aware that peace had not yet been signed. Soldiers wondered when they would go home, whether they would be paid, whether promises made during desperate years would be honored. Victory raised expectations that reality might struggle to meet. The surrender also reshaped how the war was remembered, even before it officially ended. Yorktown became a symbol of resolution, a single point where years of endurance seemed to converge. Yet that simplicity hid complexity. The war had not been a straight line toward that moment. It had been shaped by hesitation, retreat, doubt, and compromise. There is an ongoing historical debate about whether Yorktown was inevitable once France entered the war, or whether it depended on a rare alignment that could easily have failed. The answer lies somewhere in between. Structural pressures made British success increasingly unlikely, but specific decisions, naval movements, deception, timing, still mattered enormously. Yorktown was not destiny. It was opportunity seized. The closing of the military chapter also exposed the scale of what remained undone. Independence had been defended, but it had not been defined. The colonies were now states with overlapping claims, weak central authority, and unresolved social conflicts. The habits of war would not dissolve easily into peace. As armies stood down, silence replaced urgency. Camps emptied slowly. Weapons were cleaned, stored, or sold. Men who had lived by orders now faced decisions without them. The war's end felt less like a finish line and more like a sudden absence of direction. The international war continued briefly, but for America, the central conflict had effectively ended. Attention shifted from survival to settlement, from endurance to negotiation. The skills required would be different, and not all who had thrived in war would adapt easily. Yorktown closed the battlefield chapter with restraint rather than spectacle. It affirmed that the war had been won not through domination, but through persistence that made domination untenable. The trap had closed gently, not with a snap, but with a certainty that resistance could no longer be suppressed. As winter approached again, years after the first gunshot in Massachusetts, the colonies faced a quieter challenge. They had outlasted an empire. Now they had to decide what kind of nation would emerge from the long strain of doing so. The war ended in practice before it ended on paper. After Yorktown, guns fell quiet, not because peace had been declared, but because continuation no longer made sense. What followed was not relief so much as suspension, a long pause filled with negotiation, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable work of turning victory into something durable. The battlefield had decided what diplomacy now had to formalize. Peace talks unfolded slowly, shaped by interests that extended far beyond American independence. Britain negotiated not only with the former colonies, but with France and Spain as well, each pressing claims shaped by their own priorities. The American delegation found itself navigating a diplomatic world as complex as any battlefield, balancing gratitude to allies with the need to protect its own future autonomy. The Treaty of Paris, finalized in 1783, recognized the United States as an independent nation and defined its borders in generous terms. On paper, it looked like triumph. Territory stretched to the Mississippi River. Fishing rights were secured. British troops agreed to withdraw. Yet treaties describe intention more than reality. Each clause carried ambiguity. Each promise depended on implementation. For Britain, the agreement marked a recalibration rather than collapse. The empire lost its American colonies, but retained global reach. Trade resumed. Relationships shifted. Defeat was acknowledged, but not humiliation embraced. Britain adapted, as empires often do, redirecting attention toward other possessions and future influence. For Americans, peace arrived unevenly. Soldiers waited months, sometimes years, for pay promised during the war. Some never received it in full. Officers faced uncertain futures. Civilians struggled with debts incurred to support the cause. Inflation lingered. Victory did not erase hardship. It recontextualized it. Loyalists faced the most immediate consequences. Many fled, resettling in Canada, the Caribbean, or Britain itself. Others remained, navigating a landscape where suspicion persisted long after fighting stopped. Property disputes, social exclusion, and quiet resentment shaped the early peace. Independence carried costs that were distributed unevenly. The new nation also faced a structural dilemma. The Articles of Confederation, designed to prevent centralized authority, left the government weak and fragmented. During the war, shared danger had compensated for this weakness. In peace, cooperation proved harder to sustain. States pursued their own interests. Congress lacked reliable revenue. The unity forged under pressure began to loosen. Historians often note that the war solved one problem while revealing many others. Independence answered the question of authority, but not the question of governance. How power should be distributed, how debts should be managed, how disputes between states should be resolved. These issues had been postponed by necessity. Now, they demanded attention. Peace also forced a reckoning with the war's contradictions. Slavery remained intact in much of the new nation, despite rhetoric of liberty and equality. Native nations, largely excluded from negotiations, faced renewed pressure as settlers moved westward into territories secured by treaty. The war's ideals had been selective in their application, a reality that would shape future conflict. Yet peace carried genuine possibility. Trade reopened. Migration resumed. The absence of imperial oversight created space for experimentation. The same uncertainty that unsettled many also invited creativity. The nation existed more as a framework than a finished structure, waiting to be tested. The transition from war to peace required skills different from those that had sustained resistance. Compromise replaced endurance. Legitimacy replaced defiance. Leaders who had thrived in crisis now faced the quieter challenge of building institutions that could survive disagreement without collapsing. Washington, in particular, embodied this transition. His decision to resign his commission and return to civilian life sent a powerful signal. Power would not be seized by force. The army would not become a political instrument. In a world accustomed to generals becoming rulers, restraint carried its own authority. The peace was fragile, not because war threatened to resume, but because the future was undefined. The United States existed, but what it would become remained uncertain. The habits of resistance did not automatically translate into the habits of governance. As British troops withdrew and flags changed, the landscape settled into something resembling normalcy. Yet beneath that calm lay unresolved questions that would resurface in new forms. Independence had ended one chapter of history, but it had not closed the book. The war's end felt quieter than its beginning. No mysterious gunshot marked peace. Instead, it arrived through documents, signatures, and long negotiations conducted far from the places where blood had been shed. The revolution concluded not with drama, but with deliberation. Peace, like war, required patience. It demanded faith that disagreement could be managed without violence, that institutions could replace improvisation, that unity could be sustained without constant threat. These were untested assumptions, but they were now the nation's responsibility. The war had proven that separation was possible. Peace would test whether independence could be lived with, shaped, and maintained. The final judgment of the revolution would not come from treaties or ceremonies, but from what followed them. From a strictly military perspective, the American Revolutionary War stands less as a tale of battlefield dominance and more as a case study in strategic asymmetry, endurance, and the limits of imperial power projection. Evaluated without moral framing or national mythology, the conflict reveals how a materially weaker force succeeded not by defeating its opponent outright, but by making victory prohibitively expensive and strategically unrewarding. Britain entered the war with overwhelming advantages by conventional measures. It possessed a professional army, a dominant navy, experienced commanders, and access to global resources. In European terms, it did not lose the war through catastrophic defeat. Its field armies remained largely intact. Its navy was never destroyed. What failed was the strategic alignment between military effort and political objective. The British war aim was the restoration of authority over the colonies. This objective required sustained control of territory and population across vast distances, with limited local legitimacy and unreliable intelligence. Militarily, Britain could seize cities and win engagements. Strategically, it struggled to translate those actions into durable control. Occupation demanded manpower. Britain could not concentrate without neglecting other global commitments. The American side, by contrast, pursued a fundamentally different military logic, even if not always consciously articulated at the outset. The Continental Army did not need to defeat Britain decisively. It needed to survive. Every year, the army remained in existence. The strategic cost to Britain increased. Time, rather than territory, became the decisive variable. This distinction shaped command decisions. American leadership, particularly under Washington, consistently prioritized force preservation over tactical success. Retreats that appeared humiliating in isolation functioned as strategic investments. Avoiding destruction denied Britain the clear victory necessary to justify continued war. From a military standpoint, this was not brilliance in maneuver, but discipline in restraint. British commanders, trained in European warfare, often sought decisive engagements that would end resistance quickly. When these engagements failed to deliver strategic resolution, as at Bunker Hill, New York, or in the Southern campaigns, the disconnect widened. Tactical victories accumulated without producing strategic closure. This imbalance eroded political support at home, a factor no battlefield success could easily reverse. Logistics played a central role. British supply lines stretched across the Atlantic and through hostile interiors. American forces operated closer to local resources and civilian support, imperfect though it was. While American supply systems were inefficient and frequently inadequate, British logistics were more vulnerable to disruption and delay. Distance magnified every error. The Southern Campaign illustrates this dynamic clearly. British forces achieved notable successes, capturing key cities and winning major battles. Yet holding territory required constant movement and protection. Local loyalist support proved insufficient to stabilize control. American forces, under commanders like Greene, exploited this by trading space for attrition. The result was a slow degradation of British operational capacity without a decisive American victory. Naval power, often cited as Britain's greatest advantage, became decisive only when contested. Prior to French involvement, British maritime dominance constrained American options, but did not end the war. After France entered, British naval superiority was reduced from absolute to conditional. That reduction mattered more than outright defeat. It limited British flexibility and created windows of vulnerability, most notably at Yorktown. Yorktown itself was not a military anomaly, but a convergence of long-developing factors. British operational overextension, American endurance, and French naval presence aligned briefly. From a military analyst's view, the outcome was less about tactical genius and more about cumulative strategic pressure, finally producing an irreversible situation. Importantly, Yorktown did not destroy British military capacity. It removed political will. Once the cost-benefit balance tipped decisively against continued operations, military options became irrelevant. Wars between unequal powers often end this way, not through annihilation, but through exhaustion and reassessment. Internal American challenges further complicate any simplistic interpretation. The Continental Army faced chronic shortages, financial instability, and internal dissent. Mutinies, desertion, and near collapse were recurring threats. These weaknesses were not marginal. They represented persistent vulnerabilities that could have ended the war without British intervention had they not been managed with restraint and compromise. From a professional military standpoint, American success depended heavily on civilian military balance. Civilian control was weak but present. Military authority was respected but constrained. This balance prevented both fragmentation and militarization of politics. Washington's refusal to exploit military power for political ends after the war reinforced this stability and avoided the emergence of a post-war military regime, a common outcome in revolutionary conflicts. The British failure was not incompetence, but misalignment. The empire attempted to apply conventional force to an unconventional problem. Suppression required legitimacy and integration, not merely occupation. Each military escalation widened resistance without resolving the underlying political rupture. Historians debate whether Britain could have won through alternative strategies: earlier reconciliation, greater autonomy, or more concentrated force. Militarily, such alternatives were possible. Politically, they conflicted with imperial doctrine and domestic constraints. The war's outcome, therefore, reflects not a lack of options, but an inability to reconcile military means with political realities. As a military case study, the American Revolutionary War demonstrates several enduring principles. First, control of territory does not equal control of populations. Second, time favors the defender when the attacker's objectives are expansive and legitimacy is weak. Third, alliances can compensate for material inferiority if timed and integrated effectively. Finally, wars often end when continuation ceases to serve rational interest, not when one side is fully defeated. Stripped of symbolism, the war resolves into a sober conclusion. The United States did not win because it was militarily superior. Britain did not lose because it was militarily incapable. The conflict ended because the strategic cost of enforcement exceeded the value of success. From a neutral military perspective, that outcome is neither heroic nor tragic. It is structural. It reflects how wars between asymmetric forces tend to conclude when endurance, geography, and political will outweigh battlefield dominance. The American Revolutionary War, therefore, stands as an example not of decisive victory, but of sustained resistance functioning effectively within strategic limits. Its military lesson is not how to win quickly, but how to avoid losing long enough for conditions to change. In that sense, the war ended not with conquest, but with calculation. When calculation replaced confidence, the fighting stopped. The armies stood down, and the strategic logic that had governed the conflict from its earliest days finally resolved itself into peace.